right? It must be on TV.
I think he said that they are broadcasting it to some group in Brazil.
Oh, really?
We ready? Okay. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Susan Phillips, and I'm the Dean of the School of Business, one of the co-sponsors of this morning's event. And on behalf of the U.S. Army War College's Strategic Studies Institute, or SSI, and our other co-hosts, we want to welcome you to today's event. This morning's colloquium continues into a third year the excellent collaboration between the Strategic Studies Institute and our own Center for Latin American Issues, or CLAI. This collaboration has produced programs devoted to issues affecting national and hemispheric security. I'm delighted to note that SSI's director, Professor Douglas Lovelace, has traveled from Carlisle Barracks, Pennsylvania, not only just to be with us today, but also to chair one of the two panels of experts who will speak with us today. Our sister republics to the south are incredibly important to the welfare of North America. Nurturing U.S. Relations with the region, therefore, is of paramount importance. We at GW value our relations with Latin America and the Caribbean greatly. Our event today aims to draw attention to our vital interests in the region and to spark attention among policy circles on the need to intensify and broaden those relations. It's now my great pleasure to turn the podium over to Professor James Ferrer, who is from the School of Business, and he will get the program underway. Professor Ferrer.
Okay. Thank you, Dean Phillips, and welcome to everybody. We're very pleased to have you with us today. I think we're going to have a terribly interesting program, and we're more than happy to have you here with us to share it. The schedule today will be the following. We will have two panels. One will be on the economic and social issues. Then we'll take a break, and coffee and tea and water will be served upstairs on the second level. We'll have a 15-minute break, come back for the second panel, and then immediately after the second panel, we'll have a Q&A. All the panelists will be here for the Q&A, and what I ask you to do is to write the questions down so we can get the maximum number of questions that the most people want to pose. So after the first panel finishes, we ask you to have your questions ready, and the host will come down the aisles. So if you pass them over to the end of the aisles, they will take the questions, and we will then sort them out and organize them so we can read them at the Q&A session. After the second panel, we'll do the same thing. And the Q&A period will go for about 45 minutes, so there'll be ample time for comments and re-comments and extra comments, and hopefully we'll have a very interesting discussion. It's my pleasure to introduce the panel chairperson for the first panel, Dr. Inez Bustillo, a very good friend and a very good economist. She is the director of the Washington Office for the Economic Commission for Latin America. She joined ECLAC in 1989 and has worked her way up through the system, in serving in several countries and in various capacities. Prior to joining ECLAC, she was a professor in Mexico City and as a consultant to several multilateral and international financial institutions such as the World Bank. And she also taught at American University, where she earned her master's and PhD in economics. She is an Uruguayan and therefore has a very strong personal interest in what happens in Latin America and in the relationships between the U.S. and Latin America. So we're very pleased to have her with us today. For the second panel, we have Professor Douglas Lovelace, who is the director of SSI at the Army War College in Carlisle. He has come down to join us today and to chair the second panel. He has had several military assignments, both as a command and staff positions, and one combat assignment in Vietnam. He has several degrees. He has a law degree, and he has an MBA, as well as having done the National War College and let's see if I get this one right, the U.S. Army Command and General Staff College as well. He spent almost as many years in school as I did. Could never get out. So we're very pleased that he took the time to come down to us from Carlisle. So that's it for now. So I'll turn the panel over to Inez. It's all yours.
Thank you very much, Jim. And first of all, thank you very much to George Washington University and the Strategic Studies Institute for inviting me to chair this panel. It's really a privilege to be here today, this morning. And it's also a challenge because, as we all know, economics and talking about economic and social issues in the hemisphere at this time of crisis definitely presents a challenge. The past 5-6 years have been outstanding in terms of economic performance for the countries of Latin America and the Caribbean, as you well know. And Latin America and the Caribbean posted the best economic performance in 40 years, with declines in poverty. Poverty declined from 44% in 2002 to 34% in 2008. Income distribution improved in some countries. More employment was generated. And there was an overall good economic performance. But that has come to an end due to the financial crisis that has spread around the world. Growth has slowed down in the region considerably, and our latest estimates that we released last week put economic growth in 2009 at minus 0.3%. So the crisis is being spread through decline in deterioration of terms of trade, less exports of manufacturers, less tourism, less attraction of foreign direct investment, less remittances, etc. So it's a time of crisis, and as President Lula said, the best thing that the U.S. can do for the region is to start growing back again, given that the tremendous interdependence that exists between countries in the hemisphere, in particular between the U.S. and the countries of Latin America and the Caribbean. But in addition to starting grow again, we believe that there are many things that we could do together on economic and social issues and have a common agenda in the hemisphere. And for that, to discuss what elements could be present in a common agenda in the hemisphere, what areas can we work together, what initiatives and very pragmatic initiatives we can do together. We have the very three distinguished panelists and very knowledgeable about the region. I'm not going to read their CVs, given that you have them in your folders, just say a few brief words about them. To my right, we have I'm sorry, Peter. To my right, we have Ambassador Peter DeShazo, who is the director of the Americas Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, very well known by all of you. Peter joined the U.S. Foreign Service. He has been at CSIS since 2004. Prior to CSIS, he was a very distinguished member of the U.S. Foreign Service and held very high-ranking positions in that category. Then we have to his right, we have Eric Farnsworth, also very well known by all of you. Eric is the Vice President of the Americas Council and very active and tremendous advocate for trade and closer links between the region and the United States and Canada. And to his right, we have Dr. Mustafa Moharatan with General Motors. He has been with General Motors for many years now, and also a tremendous advocate for improved economic and particularly trade ties with the hemisphere and within the hemisphere. So without further ado, I would like Peter first to address this audience for about 15-20 minutes, and then, as Jim Ferrer said, we will break down and we'll come with questions later on.
Thank you very much, Ines. It's a real pleasure to be here to talk about topics that are of considerable interest and will certainly be on everyone's screen as the Summit of the Americas unfolds in the coming week. The economic crisis has drawn attention to economic and social issues in the region, frames the relationship of the countries in the region with the U.S., and underscores the need for policies that will promote long-term growth in the Americas to the benefit of all the region's citizens, especially its poorest. As Ines just said, with few exceptions, the region is coming off a period of sustained growth from 2002 that's one of the best cycles in its history. In Latin America, this is due to the excellent terms of trade, high prices for commodities, but also generally sound macroeconomic policies, monetary and fiscal, to expand trade, high levels of investment, foreign and domestic, strengthened financial sector, a buildup of reserves, lower levels of debt. This is a result of a regional trend towards more open economies and higher quality policymaking in the Americas that's been in place since the 1990s. If these changes had not been made, certainly the crisis that is affecting the region now would be hitting it much harder. And also, I think, says something about the agenda of the much maligned Washington Consensus, which is right now certainly something that people are reevaluating with the downturn. But I think there is sometimes a lack of appreciation for the quality of the reforms that had taken place since that period. At the same time, the longer-term performance of the region has been disappointing. Growth in Latin America has lagged far behind more dynamic areas, Asia above all. Yearly average GDP growth in Latin America was about 1.2% from 1975 to 2007. Of course, that includes the latest spurt. GDP per capita as a percent of developed countries was about 35% in Latin America in 1975. It fell to 26% in 2007. The cumulative rise in real GDP per capita in Latin America was 44% from 1975 to 2007, while it rose 850% in China and East Asia. There are many factors responsible for the low growth, some of which have been ameliorated, but others persist. This is a list of difficulties that need to be overcome that we're all very familiar with. The structural reform agenda, which has been pretty much on hold, labor, social security reform, tax reform, judicial reform, low levels of energy integration in many countries, underdeveloped infrastructure, which has been a negative factor in the region where exports have driven development, poor quality education, exceptionally skewed income distribution, these two factors being linked, very low investments in science and technology. According to the IDB, in 2002, South Korea spent more on research and development than all of Latin America put together. Consequently, the region's levels of competitiveness are low. One country in the region only, Chile, is in the top third in the World Economic Forum Global Competitiveness Index, and only 5 are in the top half. So the region requires sustained growth at higher rates to create jobs and reduce poverty. It has made some important progress during the high growth in the past years, as Ines pointed out, but only Chile has been able to drastically cut its overall poverty rates. For this to happen, political elites will have to pursue a policy agenda conducive to such growth, but also a social agenda aimed at improving human capital and quality of life for the less privileged. This is where the reform agenda that I mentioned just recently comes in. It is in the U.S. interest that Latin America achieve higher levels of development. Economic development, higher quality democratic governance, and improved security conditions are strongly interrelated. More prosperous countries can better confront the difficult challenges related to public security, international crime, environmental challenges, and other such factors. But what can the U.S. do? What U.S. policies can help improve regional economies? Clearly, U.S. direct economic assistance, which is already at low levels, is unlikely to increase in this difficult economic circumstance and will probably not be a factor in stimulating economic growth in the region. Trade, however, is the most significant area, perhaps where the United States can be relevant to the hemisphere. Trade has driven recent growth in the region and continues to play an important role and will continue to play an important role in the region's recovery. Prices for commodities will eventually rise again, but market access is key. And the U.S. remains the key market for the region, key supplier of products and services as well. The U.S. should promote free and open markets to stimulate trade and the flow of credit and investment in the region. It should start in its own neighborhood by strengthening its NAFTA relationship with Canada and Mexico. The recent protectionist move by the U.S. to deny entry of Mexican trucks sent a terrible signal not only to its key trade partner that is going through a particularly challenging period right now, but to the rest of the region. We should build on NAFTA, not walk back from it. The nations of the hemisphere fear protectionism from the U.S. and other developed countries. The recent G20 meeting in London happily underscored the need to avoid protectionist measures. The nations of the hemisphere will look to the U.S. for other signals as the Summit of the Americas approaches. Most hope for a sign that the administration's stimulus package is working and that the economy will revive. Those who tended to write off the importance of the U.S. economy in the region, for them this crisis has been a lesson. The administration can take further steps. It should announce its intention to ratify the trade promotion agreements with Colombia and Panama. It should abolish the tariff on Brazilian ethanol. Despite the anti-U.S. attitude of the Evo Morales administration, the U.S. should reconsider reinstating trade preferences for Bolivia. At the G20, the U.S. and other members supported increased funding for the IMF. That will help countries in the hemisphere weather the economic crisis and resume growth. On the side of human development, the U.S. can work multilaterally at the OAS and the UN as well as bilaterally to improve investments in the region, improvements in health, education, energy cooperation, and the capacity to respond to national disasters. Specifically, we should look to our renewable energy relationship with Brazil as a platform for reaching out to Central America and to the Caribbean and other areas of Latin America. U.S. interests would be well served by expanding existing initiatives and developing new ones to assist countries in the region to improve the quality of primary and secondary school education, the teaching of English, and of technical education. These are areas where relatively modest inputs can make a difference. The U.S. should increase funding for the Peace Corps. Teacher preparation, English teaching, and technical training could be part of that effort. It should promote academic and educational exchanges, both financed by the government and through non-government institutions. These build bridges between people and help develop needed human capital. The United States should work through multilateral organizations to promote not just progress in combating infectious diseases and improving public health in the region, but also helping countries encountering chronic diseases that have an increasingly larger effect on society as life expectancy rises and populations age. The new Obama administration in the United States empowers the U.S. to work with other governments in the region and with non-government organizations to more effectively encourage programs that counter racism and reach out to ethnic minority communities, especially Afro-Latin groups. In short, the United States can provide catalytic supports to efforts to improve socioeconomic conditions in Latin America, without the injection of large amounts of development assistance, which is a highly unlikely prospect at this stage. The bottom line, however, will remain that sound policymaking on the part of governments in the region and social policies that encourage sustained growth and real progress in reducing poverty and inequality will be the key. Populist solutions that provide politically attractive the inputs over the short term but do not address structural concerns or make longer-term inputs need to be avoided. Lessons learned from the past should be incorporated. We should keep what works and build on the rest. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter. This was definitely a full agenda for the U.S. and for the Americas. And we'll definitely have more questions about how to move to accomplish many of the things that you're proposing for the benefit of the hemisphere. Eric?
Do you mind if I go to the podium?
Yes. Yes.
Well, thank you, Inez. I'm going to take the opportunity to come to the podium That way I can actually get out of the lights and I can see the audience. So the fact of the matter is I appreciate very much the opportunity to be with all of you, with Dean Susan Phillips, with Jim Ferrer, and of course, as always, it's a privilege to be with you. I'm afraid that with Peter's opening remarks, what you're going to hear from me is a lot of reinforcement of what Peter just said. I don't necessarily like following you, Peter, because we have a mind meld on many.
The options are.
There's a lot of commonality, and what you're going to hear from me is perhaps a difference in emphasis in a couple areas, but very, very consistent with what Peter said, and I compliment him for his comments, which I think laid out the issues very, very well, framed them tightly, and as Inez says, there will be time for questions, which I hope all of you fully take advantage of. As Inez noted, I head the Washington office of the Americas Society Council of the Americas, organizations that for almost 50 years have helped frame the U.S. policy debate on the hemisphere. We publish the journal Americas Quarterly, which hopefully all of you have a subscription to, and if you don't, you can see me about getting one. It's the top journal for the hemisphere, and we focus on promoting democracy, open markets, and the rule of law from sea, Canada, to shining sea, Chile. So we blanket the hemisphere. And with this in mind, I want to talk to you a little bit about the economic and social issues in the Western Hemisphere, particularly, as Inez noted, given the recent economic meltdown. In the wake of the U.S. elections, it must be said that there's a tremendous opportunity to work with willing hemispheric partners in pursuit of a mutually beneficial agenda. A spirit of goodwill and cooperation with the United States, in my view, exists across the region. Exceedingly high expectations must be managed, of course, and we just saw what happened in Europe with the Obama trip, where the president was greeted as a rock star, and the expectations are well over the moon. But even as leaders prepare for the next Summit of the Americas, which Peter mentioned is coming up in Trinidad and Tobago in just a couple weeks, the expectation and the anticipation is high, with the caveat that expectations in terms of what realistically can be accomplished must also be first and foremost in everybody's mind. In some ways, as Peter mentioned, the region is much better prepared to withstand the current economic crisis than ever before, having learned hard and important lessons from the past. Economies are better run, reforms have taken hold, banking systems are largely sound, yet the region also remains highly vulnerable to the external environment, in part because it remains, even today, it remains dependent on commodities exports for growth. In fact, according to the World Bank, the link between Latin American growth cycles and commodities prices is powerful, with more than 90% of the region's population depending one way or another on commodities exports. Let me repeat that statistic, because the first time I heard it, I was astounded by it, and I continue to be astounded by it. Over 90% of the region's population depends in some way on commodities exports. Well, I was trained as an economist, which is one of my failings, unfortunately. But what you understand about that is if you're dependent on a certain product or a certain category, you know that if that product or category is doing well, you are doing well. And if that product or category is not doing well, then unfortunately you're not doing so well. And these days, commodities from agriculture to zinc have taken a beating. So as Inez mentioned in her opening comments, the very real progress in economic growth over the past number of years for the region as a whole has now been called into jeopardy because of this reliance on the commodities trade. And even before the economic crisis hit, roughly a third of the region's population was poor. That was even before the current crisis. Some governments, like those in Brazil, Chile, Colombia, and Peru, and others, were making solid progress reducing poverty and building a stable middle class. Other countries were stagnating as populist policies overwhelmed sound economics. But now prospects have deteriorated throughout the region. And this could have profound implications. Democracy, for example, remains the accepted organizing framework for hemispheric governance, but anti-democratic steps in some countries are proving worrisome. We've recently seen the results of the term limits referendum, for example, in Venezuela. To the extent populations become restless for improved economic conditions and the newly emerging middle class becomes squeezed and threatened with returning to their previous status economically, fragile democratic institutions, in fact, could come under added strain, and that's a very worrisome prospect. So that's why, in my view, and the view of my organization, the development of a new hemispheric growth agenda is so important, and I want to focus the balance of my comments on the hemispheric growth agenda. In the immediate run, a focus on access to credit, trade finance, and infrastructure development will help keep hemispheric economies from seizing up. This is in the near term. Economic stimulus programs could also be appropriately considered, as leaders just agreed, among a menu of other options at the G20 in London, with obvious reference to Latin America's past experience with hyperinflation, so one has to keep the stimulus packages within certain bounds. At the same time, the most obvious point must not be overlooked. The best way to assist the hemisphere would be to fix the U.S. economy, resisting understandable but self-defeating impulses toward trade and investment protectionism. If the current crisis has proven anything, it's that regardless of politics or ideology, much of Latin America remains dependent on the United States for its own well-being, both directly through trade and investment flows and indirectly through commodities exports to Asia and elsewhere. Open markets are key to economic recovery, growth, and job creation. Unfortunately, global protectionism is on the rise. This is to be anticipated during times of economic duress, such as what we're experiencing now. Yet it must also be resisted, because trade is one area that can demonstrably lift economies out of recession, whereas protectionism always deepens recession. As we saw in the aftermath of the Mexico peso crisis in the 1990s, keeping markets open in Mexico's case as a direct result of NAFTA contributes significantly to quicker, more robust recovery. In fact, not just in terms of Mexico, not just in terms of the hemisphere, but trade expansion must also play a role in the U.S. in U.S. recovery. A sound recovery strategy for the United States would focus on additional integration with our regional partners, not less, as well as advancement of the global Doha trade talks. As Inez mentioned, that's one of the things that Brazil's President Lula raised directly with President Obama when the two met at the White House on March 14th. It's certainly what President Obama heard directly from the Canadian Prime Minister when he went up to Ottawa. And it's also what President Obama heard from Mexican President Calderon prior to the inauguration, and what he will hear again when he travels to Mexico City in a few short days prior to the Summit of the Americas. In the wake of U.S. congressional action to bar Mexican trucks from U.S. roads in direct contravention of our NAFTA obligations, it's also, frankly, what Secretary of State Clinton heard in Mexico City when she was there. A certain pattern, ladies and gentlemen, is emerging. In fact, pursuit of a growth agenda for the Americas has always been an important aspect of successful U.S. hemispheric policy, given income distribution and political realities across the region, which Peter already spoke about. And my view is simply this: trade and investment remain among the best tools the United States has to promote growth. Peter used the word catalytic, and I really like that word. They can catalyze the growth that needs to occur fundamentally in the region itself. We cannot credibly discuss regional economic development and job creation, I believe, which is what all of us want, which is what the people of Latin America and the Caribbean want. We can't discuss that without reference to trade and investment as a tool to catalyze broader economic expansion. Of course, it's true that trade and investment alone cannot achieve regional growth with equity, as critics often say, and here we are in a college campus, so I wouldn't expect everybody to agree completely with all the things I've just said, so let me try to address some of the criticisms that perhaps are already in people's minds. Nobody has ever claimed that trade and investment alone could do it all. Hand in hand with trade and investment expansion must also go access to quality education, workforce development and labor market liberalization, anti-corruption initiatives, improved rule of law, regulatory effectiveness and transparency, rational tax policies, greater personal security, and numerous other reforms. And the United States can do much in promoting reforms in each of these areas. But trade and investment must also play a role in any successful policy approach designed to generate the growth that the region so desperately needs. Without growth, the rest of the agenda falls apart. In some quarters, in fact, it's in vogue to point out all the defects of trade and investment, all the imperfections, all the unmet expectations. As a result, critics frequently condemn trade and investment as inherently unfair and suggest that efforts to expand trade and investment in the hemisphere are therefore misguided. Indeed, ladies and gentlemen, and I worked in the U.S. government, I worked in the White House, I worked in USTR, I worked at the State Department, I worked in other agencies, I worked in Congress. Indeed, no trade agreement, no negotiated product is ever perfect. Yet all this negativity about trade, much of it simply inaccurate and politically motivated, every evening on CNN, for example, has sunk deeply into the minds of many in the United States and others across the region. These actions have consequences. As my mother, who hails from Wisconsin, would say, the chickens have now come home to roost. There are chickens in Wisconsin, not so many here in Washington, D.C. In other words, at just the time we should be working to open markets abroad for U.S. exporters while keeping U.S. markets open here at home for U.S. consumers, it's becoming more and more difficult to resist the political siren call of protectionism. And this is an extraordinarily dangerous development. So where do we go from here? As a first step, I believe we must continue to push hard for the trade agreements that we've already signed and that we have pending with Colombia and Panama. Peter already mentioned those, even though the politics in Washington are completely overwhelming the issue at the moment. These agreements are manifestly in U.S. strategic and economic interests. And since they would also open markets to nations that already enjoy virtually duty-free access for their exports to the United States, these agreements would directly create the new, good, export-oriented jobs that are well documented to pay better than average wages. This is particularly relevant, ladies and gentlemen, when the U.S. unemployment figures have just now gone above 8.5%, the highest in a generation, and unemployment figures are predicted to go higher. Those who claim that Panama and Colombia are job-destroying trade agreements have no idea what they're talking about, because the trade agreements open up foreign markets that are currently closed to the United States, while the United States is already open to those economies for the imports that we bring in from them. Because these two pending agreements, beyond these two pending agreements, creative thinking is required. The Free Trade Area of the Americas, launched in the 1994 Summit of the Americas in Miami, will not occur anytime soon, if at all, if ever, in part because the United States has not effectively engaged Brazil, by far Latin America's largest economy. In my view, the tabling of the FTAA is an opportunity missed, but it's also a reality. At the same time, the proliferation of bilateral and sub-regional trade agreements, both those to which the United States is a party and those which do not include the United States, has in fact made the conduct of business across the United States, in some cases, more difficult, not less. With that in mind, bringing together existing trade agreements under one umbrella in order to maximize their effectiveness for the people of the region is also an appropriate hemispheric policy and priority to pursue. Of course, a number of countries in the hemisphere, including Argentina, Bolivia, Ecuador, Venezuela, and others, are highly resistant to cooperation with the United States in the current environment, no matter what trade may or may not do for growth. Let's put the economics of trade aside. Some countries in the hemisphere simply don't want to sign agreements with the United States or to link more closely with the United States. That's okay. That's fine. However, beyond the harmonization of existing agreements, which we've just spoken about, we should therefore break out of the consensus-based Summit of the Americas model that has forestalled additional progress on trade and investment for the past decade, where all countries of the region have to agree before any country can move forward. Let's not be bound by geography any longer. The world is a global place. We should get our diplomacy in the same place. We should be global, not bound by geography. But rather, let's pursue negotiations with nations that want to enter into high standards, high impact agreements that have the political ability to get it done. In the first instance, North America, Latin America, and Asia trade and investment linkages should be pursued. In addition to reducing barriers to trade and investment among each other, we will potentially also begin to build enough momentum so that countries in Latin America and the Caribbean enthusiastically look to participate in such arrangements rather than grudgingly feel obliged to participate as we move ahead with those nations as true partners in promoting trade and investment-based growth agenda. And I hope this whole Asia-Latin America linkage comes up in the question and answer, because I personally think this could be the most vibrant area for future trade investment growth, particularly through the Pan-Pacific Partnership and the Trans-Pacific Partnership that countries like Chile and Singapore and Australia and Vietnam and other countries are actively pursuing. True enough, the political moment reigns, both here in the United States and also in the hemisphere. Trade expansion does not top the list of the new administration's agenda. That also includes broad-based economic recovery from the deepest recession to hit us since World War II, the imperatives of drawdown in Iraq and build-up in Afghanistan, conflict in Gaza, Iranian, and now, of course, we're reminded over the weekend of North Korean nuclear ambitions, healthcare reform, and the list goes on and on. Yet we simply do not have the luxury to wait. As the APEC meetings in Lima, Peru showed last November, the rest of the world is not waiting for us as they move ahead with increased trade and investment linkages in the Americas. And the economic crisis that we all face has added further urgency to getting the growth agenda right. So let me conclude with the bottom line, which is this. Trade and investment are a critically important, though often misunderstood, tool of regional development. They are not a panacea. They are not sufficient. But any successful U.S. policy in the Americas requires regional growth, and regional growth requires trade and investment. There is simply no proven long-term development alternative. Clearly, we are in a time of change for hemispheric policy. The region is not the same now as it was 5 or even 10 years ago. Governments have matured and economies have grown. Yes, there are troubles, and the current downturn is exacerbating difficulties, no doubt. But we have an opportunity in the near term to relaunch a new policy in the Americas based on common goals, common interests, and partnership, not partisanship. It's a moment, ladies and gentlemen, I believe we should seize, not because it's good, not because just that it's good, but also because I believe it's good for us. So I hope we can explore some of these additional comments and thoughts and questions that hopefully you all have developed in what was intentionally supposed to be a rather provocative commentary for the question and answer series. Thanks very much for your time.
Thank you very much, Eric, for your very thoughtful comments and bringing trade and investment back into the picture and as a crucial element of a successful growth strategy in the hemisphere. We're very concerned about, of course, the rise in protectionism worldwide and in the region, and 17 out of the 20 countries of the G20 now have been adopting protectionist measures, and so your defense of trade and investment as key to growth is extremely important. Mustafa, now your turn.
Okay. Thank you, Ines. And thanks to the host for inviting me. It's always a bit risky when you're the third person up on a panel. It's almost unavoidable that you're going to overlap some. I will try and avoid it as much as possible, but it really is inescapable either. Now, as was mentioned, I'm the chief economist of GM, and one of the things my group does is constantly looking at the broader picture of developments around the world to identify where some risks are for GM as well as where opportunities are. And we've been very fortunate when it comes to Latin America that along with China, it's a real bright light for GM right now. As you've seen in the news reports, our company is in serious difficulty, yet if you would look at our operations in Latin America or China, you would never get that sense. So what I want to do this morning is to give a broader, more macro approach to the U.S.-Latin American relationship. And I want to start by pointing out this time it really appears to be different. Now, some of you are thinking it's different because of the deep recession we're in. In fact, if you have followed Latin American economies, our recession is simply a repeat of recessions that have frequented many of the Latin American countries for some time. That's not what's different. What's different is that if you looked at history, Latin American economies are doing much better than you would have expected from the historical experience. As has been noted, Latin American economies are high beta economies. They're commodity-based economies, and hence when the global economy is doing well and demand for commodities is high, they tend to do well. And conversely, when the global economy slows down or declines, Latin American economies decline much more. What we're seeing this time is that Latin American economies have done relatively well. Clearly, they have not been able to avoid a global downturn. But you'd be hard-pressed to say any of the major Latin American economies are in a crisis mode at this point. There are a number of reasons, besides the endowment of natural resources, that explains why Latin American economies have remained dependent on commodities. In particular, what economists have described the curse of resource endowment. Numerous economic studies have shown that countries that are richly endowed with natural resources tend to gravitate towards rent-seeking and rent-dividing governments and economic policies. It is easy for populists to argue that the natural resource is a national patrimony and hence ought to be allocated by some government process rather than the market. Compounding the problem for Latin America has been that historically it's been a capital-short region. It relies on imported capital. Unfortunately, global capital also tends to be very cyclical. And it tends to amplify the commodity cycle. Because when the global economy is doing well, commodity prices are high. You keep hearing about these super cycles in commodity prices. That tends to create a massive inflow of capital into Latin America. And again, as things go bad, that capital flies just as fast as it entered. So basically, you have had a region that historically is dependent on commodities, which are highly cyclical. It's a region where government policy, to put it kindly, has not been exactly great. And you have a region that really has been at the mercy of what happens outside the region. So as we stand today and the global economy is crashing, and it literally is crashing, especially if you look at it from the auto industry perspective. Global vehicle sales have dropped almost 40%, and autos tend to account for about 10 to 12% of global trade. You would have thought that Latin America would be doing much worse. And yet, most Latin American economies appear to be navigating through this crisis much better than they have in the past. So the issue is this real? Can they keep dodging the crisis that appears to be engulfing the global economy? I happen to believe they can. And obviously it's a conditional statement. I think if this global recession continues for much longer, which I don't think it will, I think the U.S. stimulus will start working soon, that more Latin American countries would run into serious problems. But as long as the U.S. economy begins to turn around within this year, which again, as I said, I believe it will, I think Latin America will manage its way through this crisis better than it has in the past crisis. The irony in this is that, as was pointed out earlier by Peter, Latin America is doing well because it listened to the Washington consensus. Right now it's become very popular to criticize the advice that was coming from Washington. And by Washington, I don't just mean the U.S. government, but also the IMF and World Bank. What was the difference this time? If you look at some of the larger Latin American economies, in particular Brazil and Mexico, but also Colombia, Chile, Peru, they did not buy into the hype over a super commodity cycle. Most Latin American economies, with the notable exception of Venezuela, followed very prudent macro policies as commodity prices escalated. Take Brazil, for example. I believe it was really the exemplar economy. President Lula's administration maintained a very tight fiscal policy regime throughout this period of very high commodity prices. And mind you, they came in for heavy criticism, both in Brazil and outside Brazil. They were accused of not taking advantage of the high commodity prices, very favorable interest rates, to expand social programs, to expand the government programs. They also, unlike in previous episodes, maintained an open investment environment. And they actually lowered the trade barriers over this period. And most importantly, Brazil did not engage in resource nationalism. And as I noted, Brazil was not alone. You look at Peru, historically a fairly poorly managed economy, or Chile, which historically has been a well-managed economy, Colombia, which has all its internal problems. Yet all of these countries were maintaining fairly sound economic policies. And then, of course, there's Mexico, which is the second largest economy in Latin America. Mexico, again, deepened its economic institutions, political institutions over this period. But unfortunately for Mexico, it is extremely dependent on the U.S. economy, and in particular, it's very tied to the U.S. manufacturing sector. So among the large Latin economies, Mexico has been hit the hardest, not because of what it did, but because of what has happened in the U.S. Now, not all countries obviously follow this path. I don't want to dwell too much on it, but clearly we have the case of Venezuela, where President Chavez allowed temporary high oil prices to influence long-term planning. You also had Ecuador and Bolivia sort of operating in the shadows of Venezuela, but following similar policies without the wealth that Venezuela has in terms of oil. And Argentina still has not regained access to global capital markets. But even if you look at these economies, they all built up reserves over this period. Now, we're not exactly sure the size of the reserves Venezuela has. The government claims much higher reserves than most private sector analysts believe they do. But nonetheless, none of these countries have become basket cases, as has been typical in the past. So, if you look at Latin America, where it's most visible, this much better management of economic policy is an external debt. Over the last 5 years, as an aggregate, Latin America reduced its external debt by half. Now think about it. In the midst of a global financial crisis, if Latin America had remained where it was previously, where it was relying completely on external finance, and global financial markets froze as they did, most Latin American economies would have been in a depression by now. But because they acted prudently, they acted proactively, and used the spurt in commodity prices to actually bring down their external debts, they have been able to avoid the deep crisis. Now think about how the tables have been turned. The U.S., in some respects, was on the opposite end of the spectrum. We took the massive savings in Asia that flowed into U.S. and U.S. dollar assets and invested them in what? Not in productive assets, but in housing. If you look at housing share, real estate investment, residential real estate investment share of U.S. GDP, at its peak in 2006, it was 5 percentage points of GDP above its historical norm. Paralleling this boom in housing or residential real estate in the U.S. was the U.S. financial markets, which in a sense were recycling the Asian savings into the U.S. housing sector. Now, some have argued that in many ways this was similar to the recycling of petrodollars in the 70s into Latin America. That so much money flew into Latin America that banks, over time, kept lowering the risk thresholds for lending until it culminated in the 80s with the deep crisis in Latin America. We're seeing much the same in the U.S. right now, with all this capital that flew into the U.S. all of a sudden is finding that much of it was invested in real estate, which has the same value as it did earlier. So just like Latin America in the 70s, we have demonstrated that we could not absorb this massive inflow of capital that has occurred over the last decade into the U.S. Interestingly, it's not something new. There were economists out there. In fact, if you look at the IMF World Economic Outlook over the last decade, each and every one pointed out that this imbalance in global savings would end badly. And yet, in the midst of a boom, nobody wanted to listen to that. We all believed that the U.S. financial system was so sophisticated that it could handle that kind of capital inflow. Obviously, we have demonstrated we could not. So where does that leave us? For years, the U.S. has been obviously the largest economy in the world. It remains the largest economy in the world. But more important we were always perceived as being a very well-managed economy. Our institutions were looked upon. Our academic analysis was valued. And today we stand with many of our financial institutions in deep trouble, our government running deficits on the order of 10% of GDP, Congress engaging in, fairly protectionist behavior. How do we relate to the rest of the world, and in particular Latin America? Think about the advice we have traditionally given to Latin America. It's based on prudent macro policies. It's based on open markets. It's based on open trade. Are we going to follow the advice that we historically provided the region? I would argue that should be, and I agree completely with Eric's comment, that should be the first and foremost thing that we need to do at this point in time, which is complete the trade agreements that we have already negotiated. I think we need to send a very strong signal to the world, and to Latin America in particular, that the advice we were giving them earlier applies to us as well. Second, I think President Lula could be a very important ally for the U.S. as we move forward. As many of you know, U.S. and Brazil have had a very complex relationship. The complexity arises in part because we compete for political leadership in the region. Brazil views itself as a leader of South America. We view ourselves as leader of the Western Hemisphere, and those two quite often clash. We also compete for economic leadership. If you look at the structure of Latin economies right now, you have the Mercosur region, basically Brazil and Argentina with Uruguay and Paraguay. That's sort of the Brazilian sphere of influence. Then we have Colombia, Chile, Peru, that are sort of part of and Mexico, that are part of the U.S. sphere. And then you have Venezuela and Argentina. But the point is that we compete for both economic and political leadership with Brazil. Yet at the same time, we've had a fairly good relationship with Brazil over the years, and we cooperate on a lot of issues. President Lula has clearly reached out, both in President Bush's second term and now to President Obama, to deepen that linkages. We should accept that offer with open arms and work much more closely with Brazil as we move forward. But we also need to be careful about a third player that is emerging on the scene, and that's China. If we don't do the right things with Latin America, we will find ourselves competing with China for influence in the region. China offers a large and growing market for the region's commodity and agricultural exports. The U.S., on the other hand, is mainly a market for the region's manufacturing exports, and that does give us a very important advantage. But the point is that the region increasingly views China as its market of the future. China greatly contributed to the boom in commodity prices that we just witnessed, and hence, contrary to many of the concerns that had been expressed about China having a negative impact on the region's economy, it had a very positive impact on the region's economy. And importantly, China is also reaching out to the region. It has already negotiated a free trade agreement with Chile. It is negotiating an FTA with Peru. It has special agreements with Venezuela. And most recently, it's negotiated a swap agreement with Argentina. So China is expanding its hand through the region. And China can offer one more thing that the U.S. will be hard-pressed to offer, which is capital. China, even though on a per capita basis is a relatively poor country, it is sitting on the biggest pool of savings anywhere in the world at this point. And recall what I said earlier, which is that Latin America has always been a savings-poor region. So you take a savings-rich region and a savings-poor region, and you've got a perfect complement. The Chinese also are worried that too much of their savings is invested in U.S. dollar-denominated assets, and they want to diversify. away from the US dollar. And that's where, you somewhat scratch your head. Why would you choose Argentina as the first country to offer a big swap agreement? But Chinese are also being opportunistic. They clearly want to expand their reach in the region. And, Argentina was the first one that they could go to. But they're also making special deals with Venezuela. Again, the motivations are, numerous. China clearly wants the energy from Venezuela, and Venezuela wants to diversify away from the U.S. Similarly, China is likely to reach across to Ecuador. So the point I want to make is, if we don't do things right, and even if we do things right, China is going to become a much more important player in the hemisphere because it needs the commodities that the hemisphere can produce, and it has the capital that especially South America needs. Now, Brazil and Mexico are slightly different in that regard. Mexico is just too interlinked with the U.S. I don't expect that, and they're also worried about competition from China. Mexico probably will keep an arm's length relationship with China. Brazil, for much the same reason as it does with the U.S., will want to maintain an arm's length relationship because it does not want other players in its hemisphere interest. But nonetheless, Brazil is also a major commodity producer. It's a major agricultural producer, and China is going to be its market. So again, you will see a deepening relationship there. So what does that leave the U.S.? Clearly, the financial crisis severely limits our policy options. We're no longer the provider of advice on how to manage an economy. But, we also remain a very large market, a large open market, and a market for the region's manufacturers. So yes, China can provide the market for commodities, but we provide the market for value-added products out of the region. So, it really is ironic at this point that the countries that followed the advice we were given have done reasonably well, and as the world economy recovers, will do even better. And yet, we have lost the intellectual leverage in the region because of the economic crisis that we face. So, to close, I think we have a very different type of opportunity in the region. The region is going to look to us to see how well we follow the advice we used to give the region. It's going to look to us to see whether in difficult economic times we can maintain the open markets that we've traditionally advocated for everybody else. The region will look to us to make sure that we don't set up obstacles to the flow of capital to the countries that need it. We really have the opportunity now to partner with the region rather than to pontificate to the region. I think if we do that, we will end up with a much stronger relationship. And of course, if we fail to do that, we will face even greater challenges in our relationship with the region. I continue to believe that we will do the right thing, but I think we'll need a lot of help in Washington to keep doing the right thing. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mustafa, for your words and for highlighting aspects such as the special Brazil-U.S. relationship and how it should be handled in the future, for bringing China into the analysis of what we can do in the Americas together and how China and Latin American and Caribbean countries have diversified their trading partners and what that means for intra-hemispheric relations. It's 10:10, and this panel closes here, and I would like to ask you to join me in congratulating once again the three outstanding panelists, and we'll have questions for them later.
Thank you. That worked out well. We didn't duplicate each other.
No, it was...
Your point about the savings and the capital starved region kind of going together like two puzzle pieces makes perfect sense, and I think it's the key of understanding the relationship going forward. We don't have that ability anymore in the U.S. If we don't.
I mean, the thing was, we used to be the conduit. The Chinese money came into the U.S. and then it went to Latin America. The mess we made our system is more likely to bypass it.
And that shows, for example, at the annual meeting of the IDB, China went there, different, very strong, very promising money, and also giving money to the IMF. And it's a different world.
Very different world. London has done that for 100 years. It's not. Yeah. That's the thing that's very difficult to understand, especially because so much money from the U.S. shows up
Okay, that's great. Check, check.
Hello. May we begin the second panel? And I'd like to remind you, if you have questions, have them ready at the end of the second panel. People will be by to pick them up also. So I'll turn the panel over to our chairperson. Doug? Okay, Doug.
Thank you very much, Jim. And welcome back to everyone. It's certainly a distinct honor for me to be in the presence of such noted scholars and practitioners on hemispheric security affairs. And I look forward, as I'm sure all of you do, to the presentations that will follow. Then the presentations will be, I think, as we mentioned earlier, about 20 minutes each in length, give or take, hopefully not longer than 20 minutes in length. And that should leave us plenty of time for a question and answer period. I'd also just remind you that as you think of questions as the panel presentations are underway, please write them down and be prepared to turn them in to the folks who will be collecting them at the end of the panel. And because what we're going to do is move directly into a combined panel discussion that will feature the questions that you in the audience pose, as well as the panelists discussing what each other, the points each other have made as we've gone through the morning session here. As a government employee, I have to make the statement, since I am being allowed to talk here, the statement that any views I express are my own and not those of the United States Army, not necessarily those of the United States Army or the U.S. government, but purely mine. And you'll be able to tell that by judging their quality as we go through here. Let me just start, maybe set the context a little bit for the panel. To note the title of the panel, Governance and Security, and I thought that was, some of the most ingenious combinations of words in life are very simple and very short, and I think this is very ingenious to title this panel as Governance and Security, because if we accept the notion that security today is much more than a defense-based concept, that it's a much broader concept throughout the hemisphere, as well as even domestically within the United States, that governance or good governance is a necessary prerequisite to any measure of security in the broader sense of the term of security. And so I think it's great that this panel was entitled Governance and Security, and I know that our panelists are going to talk about the relationship of governance and security. It looks like we've taken kind of a significant departure from the topic of the earlier panel, which dealt with economics. But I think most of us in this room know, especially in relation to the conditions in the hemisphere today, that economics plays a very major role in security within the hemisphere. So really there's quite an interesting and a very palpable relationship between the first panel and this panel. And as I think back of the years that I've been working in national security, which started probably with my time at the National War College, which is quite some time ago. I was just mentioning earlier that was the year that the wall came down, and we were all trying to reformulate our thoughts at that time of what national security was going to be like now that we no longer had or it looked like we're going to have the Soviet Union around. And I recall the discussion at that time was, well, we need a fresh assessment of national security. 3 years before that, Congress passed the Goldwater-Nichols Department of Defense Reorganization Act, which most of us know helped the uniformed services of the United States to work together more jointly. What some of us forget from time to time, there's also a section of that Goldwater-Nichols National Defense Reorganization Act, and it's codified in Title 50, Section 404A, and I know only lawyers know the titles and the section numbers And so I apologize for that. But in Title 404A, that requires the president the people who drafted it really didn't know the process involved in doing this, and so they required that to be done every year. Obviously, it can't be done every year, but it required the President of the United States to reassess the national security strategy of the United States every year, and against current and postulated threats and opportunities, and to rebalance the instruments of national power as necessary to provide for security in the years going forward. And those instruments of national power are diplomatic, informational, military, and economic. So the only reason that I bring that up is, like I said, as I look back at the 15 or 20 years or so that I've been working in national security, the realization that sort of a reassessment, reappraisal of national security has always been there, at least in a theoretical sense. It's been codified in United States Code, as a matter of fact, and so it's even more than theoretical. It's actually tangible. But we have to ask ourselves the question, why has no president of the United States ever done that since it was codified into law? And so what does that have to do with Latin American security, or I should say Western Hemisphere security? And I think what it has to do with it is, I believe, if I'm reading the signals correctly, and I know that many of you are reading them also, that this new administration has a greater appreciation for the notion that security is a much broader concept than the military dimension. And that security includes the best mix, or the best balance, if you will, of all the instruments of national power, or I would say in this case of all the instruments of hemispheric power, or the instruments that are wielded by each nation within the hemisphere individually and collectively. And so I think that there's reason for optimism, and there's reason for hope that we will see hemispheric security in terms other than military security. And as my mentor and good friend, Dr. Max Manwaring, who most of us know, reminds me many times, that there are some defense dimensions to security in the Western Hemisphere today. There are some border disputes, and there are a few other things. But by and large, the security challenges that face us are much broader and involve socioeconomic, political, and many, many other factors. And so with that kind of preamble, let me not take up any more of our time, but just turn to our panelists to give their presentations. And I know that we have all of their biographical sketches in the handout material that we received today, so I won't go through and provide any introductions. But I will only say, following in the form of our earlier panel, that we are extremely privileged to have such a great slate of panelists to discuss this notion of governance and security. Carlo Dade is Executive Director of the Canadian Foundation for the Americas. Lino Gutierrez is Adjunct Professor at George Washington University. However, most of us know him as former U.S. Ambassador to both Argentina and Nicaragua. And Michael Shifter is Vice President of Policy and Inter-American Dialogue. So I think if it's okay with the panelists, we'll just move down the line, and Carlo, we'll start with you if that's all right with you.
Sure. Being Canadian, I really can't refuse, can I? I'll follow Eric's advice and get out of the lights, which actually are quite strong up there. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It is indeed a pleasure to be here. Avant tout, I have to thank Jim for the invitation to get me out of Ottawa down to Washington to enjoy this really, really wonderful spring weather. We do hope that the snow stops sometime soon in Ottawa, and we get to see the flowers and buds come out sometime soon. Actually, I was telling someone that not only is it snowing, but we had to de-ice the plane last night. So please, no complaints about the weather here, about it being cold. With that in mind, it's probably actually a good segue to touch on, I suppose, the first issue in terms of my remarks, at least. And that is, why have a Canadian at a colloque on U.S. engagement, re-energizing U.S., United States engagement in the hemisphere? There are several reasons for this. Obviously, Jim wouldn't have invited me if there weren't strong reasons. But it's probably good to step back and to take a look at these. But first, Canadian Foundation for the Americas. For those of you who are not familiar with FOCAL, I'm pretty sure everyone here is familiar with Inter-American Dialogue. That's actually a very good analogy for who we are and what we do. You can think of the dialogue, I suppose, as the American version of FOCAL. See if Michael lets me get away with that one. But the reasons for having a Canadian at a panel on U.S. engagement are many. And let me run through these very quickly, and then I'll turn my attention to one aspect of the governance issue that we share in common, in which common action is needed and is eminently feasible, and then talk very briefly about security and some elements of what we're trying to do in Canada on security that also fit with the United States and where there are areas for common engagement. In terms of the Canadian role with the United States in the hemisphere, yes, indeed, Canada does have what we consider to be a special relationship with the United States. Obviously, your President Obama made his first foreign visit to Ottawa to meet with our Prime Minister and to talk with members of Parliament and Cabinet. But beyond this, there are 180-some countries in the world, and supposedly there are 180-some special relationships with the United States. But indeed, the relationship between Canada and the United States is unique in several ways. Not only have we had a long-standing officer serving with and having command functions in NORTHCOM, formerly NORAD, but for the past couple of years, we've also had an officer serving in SOUTHCOM, similar function. Form of integration that you really don't see elsewhere. We're also thinking and discussing the possibility of having Canada join the Fourth Fleet. This is not government policy, but this is something that we in the policy community are advocating. It touches on the security role. But our ability to work with the United States closely, to be integrated into command structures, is something unique for Canada. In addition, we share a concern and focus on the Americas. It may not be known here, actually it's not well known in Canada either, but this government's second foreign policy priority, after Afghanistan, which obviously because we have troops there is our first priority, but our second priority are the Americas, and has been for several years. This government in Ottawa, under the Prime Minister, diverting resources, attention, and manpower to focusing on our engagement in the hemispheres. The other interesting thing about our focus, the broad outlines of our engagement strategy, as outlined by the Prime Minister 2 years ago on his first trip to the hemisphere, are sort of a precursor to the Obama engagement strategy. If you look at the development of Obama's strategies outlined during the campaign, it's interesting that it happens to, I wouldn't say follow, but I think we can safely say coincide with elements of the Canadian strategy outlined by the Prime Minister, focus on governance, security, and prosperity, which for us has meant pursuing aggressively free trade agreements in the hemisphere. So indeed, there is quite a bit that we share in common. Obviously, there are differences. We are engaged in the Americas because of Canadian self-interest. It's our largest trading relationship outside the U.S. We're heavily invested. Mining companies, which are a major form of Canadian foreign investment and engagement, are heavily invested in the region. So there are interests that compel us to be there beyond our relationship with the United States. We are part of this hemisphere, and we do seek to play a leading and strong role in the hemisphere. There are differences, obviously. Cuba is the most obvious that one can think of. But there are also differences in other matters. We have a different model for regulation in Canada, especially in the financial sector. And we're aggressively talking with the region about differences to the U.S. models. So there are differences, obvious areas like Cuba, more subtle ones like regulation. But in fact, the broad areas of convergence, from Haiti to engagement with Chavez and in the Caribbean, leave more areas for commonality and the development of joint projects and working together on an exercise to engage, not just for the United States, but also for Canada. Other factors that are of interest and importance in terms of donors. There are two donors from within the hemisphere, the United States and Canada. Currently, Canada is the largest bilateral donor in the Caribbean, the second largest donor in Haiti. Two areas of great importance for the United States, your third border, to use the old Colin Powell term. We're also involved at the OAS, the second founder, an area in which the United States places great importance and which Canada also plays great importance, where we've worked together in the past. So those are some of the reasons that we can think of to think about including Canada or to consider the Canadian perspective as we look towards U.S. engagement in the hemisphere. So very quickly, on the governance front, I'd like to highlight one issue, something that we both share in common, that's a great concern to both of us, an issue in which we both invested a great deal of time, effort, and treasure. And that is the event that's happening next week in Port of Spain, Trinidad and Tobago, the Summit of the Americas. What we've seen recently in the hemisphere, since the first summit in Miami over 15 years ago, we've seen the lessening of importance of the Summit of the Americas. At the same time, the summit itself was such a good idea, was so successful, the first summit in Miami, that it was picked up by other organizations and other powers with interest in the hemisphere. Recently, we've seen the rise of the European Union, Latin American and Caribbean Summit. The Spanish and the Portuguese have created their own heads of state meeting. Brazil has just launched a Caribbean Latin American integration process, essentially another heads of state meeting. And the Rio groups become revived. As these other summits have taken off, there's been a diffusion within the Americas of the hemispheric agenda, of the governance agenda, and a weakening of the power of the Summit of the Americas. Yes, the summit has shot itself in the foot and has not underperformed. But part of that, I would argue, has also been through the rise of these other summits. Why is this of issue? Why is this of importance? We really don't expect much out of the summit. But yet, if you think about it, the summit is the only hemispheric heads of state meeting to which the Americans and Canadians are invited to participate. The Ibero Summit, we're not there, though unofficially, it looks like Canada will have an opportunity to join the Ibero Summit as an observer, some sort of associate status. But that depends largely, I think, on what happens in Port of Spain. The Brazilian-led summit, we're not invited. Neither are the Americans. The Rio group, again, we're not there. So it's very important, I think, for both of us in terms of hemispheric engagement and the leadership role that we both seek to play in terms of governance in the hemisphere, that something be done about the Summit of the Americas. We really need to look at putting the effort and the resources into making the summit serious and to revitalizing that. There are several things that we can do. One, look to institutionalize the Summit of the Americas into the OAS. We have a very good model for how a successful hemispheric summit can be run. And that model actually comes from Spain and the Ibero-American process. The institutionalization, the resource, the budget, how to set the agenda, how to work with countries, are pretty much on the table from what Enrique Iglesias has done in Madrid. It would be quite easy for us to duplicate these things by institutionalizing the summit into the Organization of American States. But this will not happen without money and without leadership. And within this hemisphere, the money for this to happen and the leadership will have to come from Ottawa, and it will have to come from Washington, D.C. So I put this on the table as something to be considered in terms of our engagement on the governance issue. In terms of security, this has really been a tough issue up in Ottawa. Obviously, within the hemisphere in the past few years, we've seen a paradigm shift. The security paradigm in the hemisphere has changed dramatically. You in the United States are a bit more familiar with this. You can think of this conceptually in the move from Plan Colombia to the Merida Initiative. You've been involved in the shift from the era of guerrilla wars and interstate conflict to the era of narco wars, drug cartels, and gangs. Essentially, it looks like the era of political or ideological warfare in the hemisphere is over. It's being replaced by an era of insecurity fueled by finance, money, not by ideology and not by politics. This has been a huge shift, I think, in the hemisphere. Yet, if you look at the security structure of the hemisphere, it hasn't shifted to match the change in the threat matrix in the hemisphere. We still heavily fund militaries, military spending, defense budgets, yet it's obvious that we need increased spending on domestic security, justice, police reform. These sorts of reforms will be expensive in terms of finances, in terms of resources, in terms of time, in terms of attention. Yet we continue to put so much money into traditional defense budgets. Yes, in certain countries, defense budgets are coming down. You think of parts of Central America, but they can come down further, and they need to come down further. Enabling this is something that may be of interest to the United States, but I think what is of interest to the United States is finding a way to fund the increase that we need to see in police reform and justice reform. This money cannot come from the development banks, and it appears that the U.S. is probably close to tapped out with Merida and Plan Colombia. There is money, however, within the hemisphere, looking to shift from defense spending to domestic security spending. One idea, and something we've actually talked, there's been talks between the Pentagon and Canada about, is the move to unified force command structures of the militaries within the hemisphere. This is an experiment, a project that we undertook in Canada, uniting the Navy, the Army, and the Royal Canadian Air Force into one unified command structure. Huge savings in terms of administration, human resources, unified pension system, procurement, everything. So this is one way, I think, to look at an immediate impact or a near-term impact in terms of both improving the security environment, improving professionalism, improving efficiency, and also enabling resources to shift. Other areas that we're looking at, training. The U.S. is engaged heavily in training of police forces. This is something we've begun to work on, and there's great possibilities to work together to support a common agenda for security reform in the hemisphere. Financial crimes are another issue that we have great expertise in, and we're looking to work with the U.S. and help the U.S. on those issues. But really, we need to think, I think, in terms of the security paradigm in the region about the shift from threats based on ideology and politics to threats based on simple criminality and how to respond and how to deal with that. And that's going to require a resource shift. I think in Canada, if the U.S. is willing to work on this, we can really help. And this is an area of common engagement. Finally, there are other things that were mentioned this morning. The area goes beyond just governance and beyond security. I think it was Peter Shaso who mentioned the U.S. increasing the Peace Corps. Again, in terms of another donor, another country that's involved as a contributor to the development process in the hemisphere, this is something that is another area for cooperation, a joint agenda for engagement. Our Canadian University Services Abroad is a perfect ally overseas, is a perfect ally in this endeavor. Trade. The trade agenda is alive and well in Canada. We are aggressively pursuing free trade agreements throughout the hemisphere. The writ on the Colombia and Peru free trade agreements were dropped last week, so we have about 40 days till those come up for vote in Parliament. In that regard, we could actually use some help from the United States in terms of support for the agreements as opposed to the letters we've been getting from certain Congress people urging parliamentarians to vote down the agreements. But there is a common agenda on trade, too. Our perspective, though, is to make sure that the agreements benefit the vast majority of the population. And this is another area where I think we can work together to share, making sure the agreements actually improve living conditions for people in the countries with whom we sign the agreements. We're putting a great deal of money, $17 million, with the Peru and Colombia agreements to make sure that the agreements benefit small producers, marginalized producers, and non-traditional exporters. This, again, is an area to work together. We share a lot in the hemisphere in terms of values, ideology, and a desire to see more principled and beneficial U.S. engagement in the hemisphere. Thank you. I'll leave it there, and hopefully there was enough of controversy for questions. Thank you.
Well, Carl, I think that you did leave us with quite a few thoughts that should resurface again during the question and answer period. I think you put it very well that there's a change in paradigm in security in the hemisphere. And I would hope that as one of the leaders in the hemisphere that the United States national security policy formulation apparatus would come to that realization as well. And I think there are signals that it is. So thank you once again for those very, very good and very informative comments. Ambassador, would you go ahead?
Thank you. Pleasure to be here and seeing old friends. Jim Ferrer, we share a Portuguese connection, Ray Marin, and others. April 17th, 2009, other than being the 38th anniversary of the Bay of Pigs invasion, it'll also be the first time Barack Obama, President Obama, will meet with the leaders of the hemisphere. And I agree with Mr. Dade about the weakening of the Summit of the Americas. I remember 1994. Some of you were toddlers then, but in 1994, President Clinton called the first Summit of the Americas in Miami, and it was quite a time. It was, right 5 years after the wall had fallen down. We were talking about that. The End of History, Francis Fukuyama was writing at that time. And we thought, we Latin Americanists, we thought we were home free. 33 out of the 34 leaders of the hemisphere had come to power via the ballot box. 2 were women. This is what many people have been fighting for years to achieve in the hemisphere. In 1967, at the previous summit, half the participants answered to the title of general or colonel or whatever. In 1994, 2 were women. So it was a tremendous time. The summit was a great idea, but 15 years later we find a weakened summit. And I think part of it is the demise of the FTAA. The FTAA was a big ticket item for the Summit of the Americas. At the time, it was inconceivable that the leaders of the hemisphere had agreed to establish a free trade area of the Americas. I was in Mar del Plata in 2005 when the dream was shattered and by the position of Mercosur. I don't know if engaging Brazil, as Eric Farnsworth, I believe, recommended, or was it Peter, would have made a difference. I think by that time the die was cast. Even though about 20 countries stood up and said, we want free trade. And I recall a very emotional discussion between President Toledo of Peru and President Chavez of Venezuela, where President Chavez was claiming to be the spokesperson for the poor in the hemisphere. And President Toledo looked him in the eye and said, Hugo, don't talk to me about poverty. I know poverty. I came from poverty. And anyway, exciting moments. We had Diego Maradona, Cindy Sheehan, Evo Morales, and the Argentine government having a presence at the anti-summit and at the actual summit. It makes for good stories. In any case, what does President Obama see when he looks southward, when he starts to engage the hemisphere? Well, security-wise, things have, I would argue, improved markedly. I mean, we all remember the civil wars of the 1980s in Central America. We all remember the military regimes, the dirty war in Argentina, military governments in Chile and Uruguay and the like. One tremendous achievement that we have in this hemisphere is the fact that the military is in the barracks. Nobody's calling for the military to come out anymore and be the saviors of the country. That battle has been fought and won. In recent years, some military leaders have tested the waters a little bit and met an immediate response from all the countries of the hemisphere saying, don't you dare. The whole hemisphere will come down on you if you do that. So I think that is a significant achievement. And you can go back to President Carter's human rights policy and President Reagan following President Carter keeping the human rights policies, but changing the style a little bit. And ever since then, the United States has stood for democracy. No longer do we have the he's an SOB, but he's our SOB phrases that characterized the 40s and the 50s during the Cold War. You're either a Democrat or you're not. And one of the big the major achievement, perhaps, of the summit process was the Inter-American Democratic Charter. And I was with Colin Powell on September 11th, 2001, when that document was signed. And when Secretary Powell opted to stay because he thought it was important enough to sign the document before he got on his plane to find out what had happened in the United States. So, security-wise, the one unsolved problem, of course, is the war on drugs and the weakening of democratic institutions. We're seeing the dramatic example of it in Mexico, where President Calderon has very courageously decided to take on the narco-traffickers. I do think he will need something more than unleashing the military and the drug traffickers. I'm not the only one saying that. There has to be a coherent strategy that attacks, of course, corruption, education, and some of the conditions that lead to the drug traffickers, doing what they're doing in Ciudad Juarez, which is like Dodge City these days. And, of course, Colombia, where Plan Colombia has been a success, a bipartisan Plan Colombia, which started under President Clinton and was kept up by President Bush. And it's palpable, the euphoria one feels in Colombia. I was in Cartagena last year, right after the hostages had been liberated, including Ingrid Betancourt and the 3 Americans. The collective feeling among Colombians is one of pride, one of brotherhood, and the Colombians have been through a lot. And I think President Uribe should get a lot of the credit. Yes, there continue to be human rights problems, but who would have thought that President Uribe would have extradited paramilitary elements to the United States? So we need to continue to help President Uribe. I would recommend that the administration sign the Colombia Free Trade Agreement as soon as possible. The election's over. It's time to help Colombia. I mean, President Obama said he supported the Peru Free Trade Agreement. I'm not an expert in free trade agreements. Eric worked at USTR. Maybe he can tell us what the difference is. I don't see much of a difference between the Colombia and the Peru Free Trade Agreement. So we should encourage the administration to do what it has to do to continue to support free trade in Panama, Colombia, and the rest of the hemisphere. So I echo what Peter and Eric said this morning. So Mexico and Colombia have to be helped as they continue to fight the new security threats of this hemisphere. I don't believe, as some are proposing these days, that decriminalization is a solution that will advance our cause against the drug traffickers. I don't want to tell my daughters and grandchildren that our solution to the drug problem was to throw up our hands and say, there's nothing we could do. Continuing the look at the hemisphere, what does President Obama see? Well, I think he will see that, unfortunately, democracy has eroded in the hemisphere in recent years. Yes, we won the battle for free elections. Every government of the hemisphere has to at least pay lip service to free elections. They have to hold elections. But 18 presidents in the last 25 years, 18 Latin American presidents have resigned or been forced out of office, often with mobs at their doorstep, like President de la Rúa in Argentina in 2001, who left from the rooftop of the Casa Rosada in a manner that reminded one of the U.S. ambassador leaving Vietnam. Forcing presidents out of office has become something that is not that not that remote anymore. Democratic institutions are not strong in many countries. We're seeing, in the case of Venezuela, an attack on the opposition by death by 1,000 cuts. Yes, President Chavez will hold elections, but he will prevent many of his opponents from participating by making them ineligible, accusing them of real or imagined corruption charges, and pretty much taking over institutions by putting his supporters in the Supreme Court and in other institutions. We're seeing the same thing in Nicaragua, where Daniel Ortega feels strong and confident enough to hold fraudulent elections, fraudulent municipal elections in which the opposition clearly won. And yet the hemisphere which signed this document, this Inter-American Democratic Charter, which says dictators should not apply. This is a club for Democrats, with a small d, in this hemisphere. And yet they look the other way when things like this happen. The tactic these days by many leaders to consolidate power is to call for constitutional conventions, which will prolong their term in office and weaken their opposition. So I guess what the summit planners in '94 foresaw was that democracy will be a norm, but nobody anticipated the fact that democracy would be attacked from within by people elected to office, as we saw in the case of Venezuela and other cases. So we've seen these constitutional conventions or constitutional maneuvers in Venezuela, Bolivia, and Ecuador, and Nicaragua maybe next. And to me, the most blatant example of how democracy is on the back burner in the hemisphere is the re-inclusion of Cuba into hemisphere institutions. The Rio Group. The Rio Group has just invited Cuba to rejoin, and Raul Castro dutifully traveled to Brazil to be welcomed by his brethren of the hemisphere as a prodigal son who returned. I read the communique which the Rio Group put out in stating that Cuba had been invited back. And it was something out of Orwell, because in the preamble, the document said, recognizing that democracy is the preferred mode of government and should be defended, and reaffirming our commitment to democracy. Scroll down later on, we welcome Cuba into the ranks of the Rio Group. Mercosur, which has a democracy clause that states that only democracies need apply, have invited Cuba to become a member. 7 Latin American presidents have visited Cuba recently to get their requisite photo with the dying dictator in the tracksuit, and not one word about democracy, about human rights. Not one meeting with Joanny Sanchez, the courageous blogger who is blogging about the Cuban situation with one eye looking behind her as state security follows her every footstep, or with Antunes, the Afro-Cuban leader in Placetas who's been conducting a hunger strike for better conditions for the 200-plus political prisoners, or a word about Oscar Elias Bisset, who was jailed for the crime of dangerousness, which means the government knows you're going to do something, so we're going to put you in jail to prevent you from doing it, who's spent the better part of 10 years in jail. And yet, Michelle Bachelet, Lula, to say nothing of Correa, and other hemisphere leaders think nothing of going to Cuba. And where's the Inter-American Democratic Charter? And even Jose Miguel Insulza, the Secretary General of the OAS, is talking about bringing Cuba back into the fold. Well, wait a second, don't we have a democratic charter? Well, nobody's talking about that. So it's become politically correct now to have Cuba in the room in the hemisphere. And reportedly, President Obama will be getting a request from the Latin Americans to lift the embargo in Cuba. And I know there are people close to the president who would like to do that. And some, like the Brookings Institution, have called for doing so without asking for anything in return, because the Cubans will never accept. So it should be a unilateral gesture by the United States. Okay. I don't see it. I just don't think that we should, at a time when Cuba, the Cuban regime has become such a great anachronism in the hemisphere. To unilaterally lift the embargo and ask for nothing in return, I don't think sends a good signal for democracy. And what does that do to the political prisoners and all the people who've been fighting in Cuba, the Oscar Elias Bicets and others who are in Cuban jails? So President Obama does have some assets going into the Summit of the Americas. Even though U.S. popularity reached all-time lows in the hemisphere in the last few years, his election has changed the dynamic of the hemisphere. President Obama is a rock star, not only in Europe, but in Latin America, and every Latin leader will just watch it on April 17th. They'll be trying to get their picture with President Obama. What should President Obama tell the hemisphere? I think, well, he has said he's going to listen, and I think that's great. I think for the U.S. president to go there in a listening mode is something new and long overdue, and I think it's a good thing. But I do think that it's an opportunity for him to reiterate the U.S. commitment to democracy. At a time when democracy is being eroded all over the hemisphere, it's a good time to rededicate ourselves to democracy in the hemisphere. No more fraudulent municipal elections in Nicaragua. No more imprisoning of opponents with the hemisphere largely silent. It's time for the hemisphere to step up and recommit itself to democracy. It would be nice if he were to reaffirm the U.S. intention to ratify the free trade agreements with Colombia and Panama. And I agree that it's a good time for a rededication to ties with the hemisphere. And you know, I think aid is a good thing, development assistance is a good thing, but at the end of the day, you teach the people to fish rather than give them fish. So I would propose in the next few years steering a bit away from the traditional methods of aid and try to help the Latin American countries and Caribbean countries insert themselves into the world economy as best they can in these troubled economic crises. Exchanges. To me, there is no better investment in the hemisphere than promoting exchanges. I used to have an Argentine lawyer who would tell me that he had thrown rocks at the U.S. Embassy when he was young. And lo and behold, one day the United States invited him to go for a Fulbright in the United States. And today that lawyer, after spending a year in the United States, I think it was in Iowa or Minnesota or somewhere in the Midwest, is the staunchest defender of the United States and U.S. values in Argentina that I met. So I think any money spent on exchanges, be they exchanges at the undergraduate, graduate level, Fulbrights, are all a very good thing. We should try to facilitate the use of technology. I think maybe the jury's still out on Nicolás Negroponte's experiment in Uruguay, where every Uruguayan child has been given a computer or is about to be given a low-cost computer. But that's something to watch and something where the United States might be able to persuade the Microsofts of the world and others to play an important role in building a bridge for Latin America and the Caribbean to join the global economy. And let's take a page from the French. I never say that too often, other than finishing the Panama Canal. The French are very proud of their language, of their culture. Let's promote the teaching of English. English is the international language, the language of the global economy. Let's facilitate English classes on the internet, etc. Oh, you're being culturally arrogant. Well, if it helps Latin Americans join the global economy and helps alleviate poverty, why not, I say. So, President Obama will have a very good opportunity to to resetear, as Chavez said, to reset relations of the hemisphere. I will predict here that President Obama will spend less time on the hemisphere than President Bush, and will not be accused of neglecting the hemisphere by either the media or the Latin American publics. His personal prestige and charisma is such that not since President Kennedy was elected in 1960 has there been a comparable leader. And I think this will buy the U.S. a lot of capital. Just the fact that an African American has been elected president of the United States. I mean, can you imagine in Cuba, where Fidel Castro has been telling his people for 50 years that African Americans can never get anywhere in the United States because they're second-class citizens. I'm sure they're running the scenes of Bull Connors, German Shepherds in Birmingham in the 60s with a great deal of regularity. And here an African American is president of the United States. There's a group called Cuba Barometro that recently conducted a poll, a clandestine poll, in Cuba. And Cuba is today 60% Afro-Cuban of African descent, pretty much. And they asked Cubans, can an Afro-Cuban lead Cuba? Can you see that in your future? 80% said no. 7% said yes. 13% said no opinion. So the world, and Latin America is no exception, is expecting great things from President Obama. And I think we have a golden opportunity to do some things right at a critical time. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Ambassador. You set the context nicely for your remarks with a short walk through recent history that helped us appreciate the accomplishments of we've witnessed in the hemisphere in the last 10, 20 years, but also laid out the significant challenges that remain. And so we certainly appreciate that. The war on drugs, of course, first and foremost in the minds of many, and you acknowledge, I thought very appropriately, the courageous fight that's being fought by the Mexican government today against that degree of criminality. And we thank you for the great recommendations that you posed as well that are very tangible and, as the military term goes, actionable. So we certainly appreciate that. And so now we'd like to turn to our final panelist for this session of our program today, Michael Shifter. And Michael, if you'd like to take it from here.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Lovelace, and it's a great pleasure to be here. Unlike my colleagues, I enjoy the lights shining directly on me, so I'm gonna sit here if that's okay. I wanted to thank Jim Ferrer as well for inviting me, and thank all of you for coming this morning. I think it strikes me, just continuing with the summit theme, which I think is the right one, given that President Obama has never been south before, and this will be next week. He's going to Mexico and then going to Port of Spain. I think it's the right focus for this session. And it strikes me that there are three main issues that are going to be in the air, and they've been mentioned already. I think the first was covered in the first session on the economic crisis, which Ines talked about and the other panelists talked about. I think we're in for a couple of rough years in Latin America, and some of the data that Ines gave were pretty sobering, especially in contrast to the previous 5 years or so. That's going to be on the minds of everybody at the summit, and certainly will be shared with President Obama. The second issue is more relevant to this session, which is transnational crime, a lot of it fueled by the drug trade, which we're now very focused on Mexico, and the media is focused on Mexico, understandably so, but this is a much wider regional hemispheric problem, and even if you go to the Southern Cone, you certainly, this is at the top of the agenda of many governments and many societies in the region. The third is I'm not going to talk too much about this, but is Cuba question. And I know Ambassador Gutierrez talked about it. I'll make a few comments about it. A little bit different than Ambassador, but I think the reality is that this is an issue that a lot of leaders are going to want to talk about because it is. Whatever one thinks about the position of Latin American governments, it's been perhaps the issue that's most divided Latin America from the United States in recent years. And therefore it's going to be on the minds of people when the slogan is time for a change or change we can believe in. That's the test. Cuba is the test for good or for bad. But I think if we're going to be realistic and look to see what we should expect in Port of Spain, that's going to be an issue. I think the most significant thing about the summit is precisely this, is that this is really, unlike previous summits that were mentioned, this is really, I think, a time when everything is on the table to discuss. And I'm not sure that existed quite the same way before. That's because Latin America's changed. It's because the United States has changed, doesn't have quite the capacity to influence developments as it did before. It's because there's an economic crisis and there's not a lot of resources. And it's because the U.S. is inundated and consumed by other issues, the economic crisis here and, of course, other foreign policy priorities. So that means that there are some issues that are really, open to discussion, I think, as never before. And one of these is this transnational crime question, which is related to the drug issue. I would argue that not only is the drug problem still there in Latin America, but I think it's gotten a lot worse. And not only gotten a lot worse, but there's a lot less attention focused on it. There's less debate, there's less discussion, there's no consideration of alternatives. In this presidential campaign in the United States, it wasn't an issue at all. I lived in Peru 20 years ago for 4 years under the first government of Alan Garcia. There were debates constantly about the drug issue. Today, 20 years later, despite Peru's very impressive progress in economic areas and other areas, drug trade is by many accounts worse. Very little policy discussion. So I'm not sure that this is, and this is the major, this session's about democracy, about democratic governance. There's no bigger risk or threat to democratic governance in every country in this hemisphere than crime that's to a large extent related to the drug trade. And to not focus and confront this issue at the summit seems to me to ignore the central problem. Now, the question is, what's the answer? I don't think the answer is clear. I'm not sure if decriminalization, I agree with Ambassador Gutierrez, is the answer. I think where that's been tried, the results have been mixed at best. I don't think there are clear answers or alternatives. But that doesn't mean that what has been tried and hasn't yielded a lot of results should be continued. There should at least be an effort to raise the issue and to talk about different ideas, different alternatives, different options. The President and Mexico, I think, will force this because Mexico is at the top of the agenda here. It's on the front pages of every newspaper. There's no issue. 5 months ago, 6 months ago, nobody was talking about Mexico. Today, everybody's talking about Mexico. And I'm not sure in the near term it's likely to improve. So we have the Secretary of State who goes, Hillary Clinton, who makes a statement about the demand for drugs in the United States being a major part of the responsibility or the explanation for this at the United States, which I think went further than any other senior U.S. official has gone, although there had been certainly talk of shared responsibility. I think she took it to another step. You have a recent commission that's come out with former President Gaviria of Colombia. Certainly as a former president, he was very much and sort of helped carry out a lot of this drug policy. But him, along with the President Zedillo of Mexico and Cardoso of Brazil, have talked about a new paradigm for thinking about the drug issue, rethinking some of the old assumptions and some of the old policies that just in terms of results haven't been very successful. It's interesting to think President Bush's father, the first President Bush, when he was president, he had two summits focused on the drug issue, one in Cartagena, Colombia, one in San Antonio, Texas. In the 8 years of Bill Clinton and in the 8 years of George W. Bush, there wasn't a single summit with heads of state that just was concerned with this issue. I like to go back to the first President Bush. Seems to me that was a sensible way to approach it, to sit down like he did with counterparts from the region to say, okay, let's talk about what to do. That hasn't been done. I'm not sure the term war on drugs is very useful. I think we have to think of a different way of framing it. Even President Calderon, who we all applaud and praise for his courage and his commitment to this, prefers not to use the term war on drugs. That has all sorts of connotations that perhaps don't get us very far in trying to address this issue. There are other things to do. Money laundering is obviously a big area, which hasn't, I think there's been some progress on that, but obviously a lot more needs to be done. The whole question of police, professionalizing police, which has sort of been off the agenda a little bit too much, needs to be back front and center on the agenda. Plan Colombia, which I think has been successful in reversing the decline in the security situation in Colombia. One of the major benefits or outcomes of that was precisely the presence of police forces, which weren't in many municipalities a decade ago, and now are in every municipality, all 1,300 municipalities in Colombia. Police presence, police at the local level is fundamental. And there are still many areas of Latin America where you don't have the presence of the state. And I think I think the police development, professionalization of the police really needs to be strengthened enormously, and the United States can play an important role. I do want to mention as well, if I don't, then Luigi Einaudi will never forgive me, also is just something very concrete and very specific, which is urging the ratification by the U.S. Senate of what's called the Inter-American Convention Against the Illicit Manufacturing and Trafficking in Firearms, Ammunition, Explosives, and Other Related Materials. This is known as SIFTA, not to be confused with SHIFTA, by the way. And the United States has not ratified this. This would only be against illegal arms smuggling. It wouldn't threaten the Second Amendment. So I think if over 90% of all the crimes committed in Mexico are with arms that come from the United States, I think it's a little bit too easy to say, well, we have the Second Amendment, because this is illegal smuggling, and there are steps that could be taken, I think, concretely to work together to try to reduce it. You're not going to eliminate that, but I think to reduce it. Let me just make a few more points. I think on Cuba, again, all I'm going to say on that is I do think this is going to be an issue that's going to be on the minds of many in Latin America, to look at what President Obama has to say. I think this is an opportunity for him to listen and also to raise precisely the questions that Ambassador Gutierrez talked about to his Latin American counterparts about, whether reincorporation or reintegration in the OAS, the Inter-American system, how does one reconcile that with the Democratic Charter, which all of the member states have signed. These are issues that I think need to be discussed, and I think there needs to be a good exchange on them. I don't think there's been that kind of exchange at this kind of setting before, and I think that's extremely important. And I think, again, if I could just underscore that what's going to be different about this summit is that I think there'll be space to do that for the first time, given the nature of our president and given the conditions in both the United States and Latin America. On the democracy issue, I agree that it's crucial, but I think we have to also face the fact that the language, again, I come back to language that's used on democracy promotion, doesn't quite have the resonance and appeal that it once had in the first summer of the Americas in the 1990s with the end of military dictatorships. I think one has to be very, very careful in the way one frames the issue. Why? Because I think, frankly, the war in Iraq, I think, which was carried out in the name of democracy, I think has left a bad taste for a lot of people, a lot of Latin Americans, as well as people here. And so I think a new language in terms, without abandoning the commitment. And let's not forget the other upshot of the summit process. Not only was the free trade area of the Americas, but in Quebec City, I'm sure Carlo remembers that, the Inter-American Democratic Charter, which I think is important, needs to be brought back in. But somehow with a different language, and again, what Tom Crothers, who is my colleague here at the Carnegie Endowment, calls to detoxify, as he calls it, some of the language about democracy promotion. I would only add that given what Ines told us in the first session, and I agree with about the economic prospects, which are very bleak in the region over coming years, I can't imagine that the political implications of the economic crisis are going to make democracies much stronger or going to improve the security situation. If anything, I think we're in for a very tough situation, which means that the democracy issue has to be brought back because they're going to see a lot of these transgressions and I think reversals that we've seen in democracy, which is, I think, as Ambassador Gutierrez said, already eroding in a number of places. The economic crisis is not going to make that any better, I don't think, or any more robust democracy. Two more points before I conclude, if I could. One, again, is the role of Brazil, and others have mentioned this in the first panel, and a colleague here, but I think if we're talking about security, democracy, governance, Brazil is absolutely crucial because if there's one message that I think President Obama will bring to the summit and that he certainly brought in his European tour was the focus on multilateralism. And multilateralism in this hemisphere means very little unless Brazil is on board, unless there's agreement, whether it's on trade, and whether it's on the drug issue, democracy issue. Brazil is absolutely crucial for the United States. And I think the two examples of where the Brazilian UNASUR, which is the Brazilian-led organization, I think played an important role on questions of security and democracy. One was in the Bolivia situation and helping to broker a deal between the Congress of Bolivia and the government of Bolivia for the constitutional referendum. And the second was the conflict that erupted just over a year ago between Colombia and Ecuador and Venezuela, where I think Brazil did play an important role in trying to diffuse tensions and trying to maintain stability. So that connection with Brazil with the Obama administration is absolutely crucial to advance that agenda. I'd also mention Haiti. Mexico is called a failed state, I think, incorrectly. Haiti is probably a lot closer to a conception of failed state, and this is one area where one country where there has been cooperation multilaterally in the hemisphere, but the security situation doesn't look like it's likely to improve in the short run. So I think there needs to be a sort of a enhanced effort, and I think something that President Obama should take very seriously as one of his priorities. And the final point, and I'll conclude with this, is the U.S., what the U.S. can most do for Latin America, besides, as Ines said correctly, getting its own economic house in order, is to try to bring Latin America into the global fora, global organizations on global issues. As Eric Farnsworth said in the first session, all these issues are global. And Latin America, and that's why I think the G20 was a step. You had 5 countries from this hemisphere who participated in the G20 on the financial crisis. And I think what the United States can do and work with Latin America is on all of these issues. And one we haven't talked about at all today, which is immigration, hasn't really come up, but that's another issue that's of great concern. in the region. But all these issues are really global questions. The drug issue is not going to be solved unless there's a global approach. So that is really the major, I think, contribution that the United States can make. And I think maybe the summit begins on April 17th could begin to prepare the ground for that new type of cooperation. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. And we thank you especially for bringing home the point that due to a confluence of events at this point in history that this summit could be very important and potentially many topics could be discussed in a very substantive way that were not in the past. I think now I'll turn it back over to Dr. Ferrer.
Okay, thank you very much. I'd like to remind you, if you have questions, please pass them to the aisle so they can be picked up, and we'll proceed to that. I'd like to invite the members of the first panel to join us on the stage.
I hope not, because as you said, it's a good forum to.
Oh, also stepped up to offer those.
Are you here?
No one has.
Why don't you?
We already have.
Oh, that's right, Quebec.
Yeah.
French guy.
That's me too. Now we have capable of stepping up to host.
Okay, I have several questions, of course, that have already been turned in, but before I turn to the questions, I'd like to ask if any of the panel members would like to comment on what has been said by the other panelists, or some points they'd like to add to what they made in their statements. No? Everybody's going to be gentle, huh? Well, that's too bad. Well, then let's turn to the first question for the entire panel.
I disagree.
If you could pick one issue to help stimulate the U.S.-Latin American relations, what would that be? Where the U.S. could take action in one specific area that would have the major impact on Latin America. What would that one area be? Do I have a volunteer?
Well, I'll jump in here. I'm not sure that there's one magic bullet, certainly, and we've done a lot of thinking about this, as have others across the table. I think there are probably a couple things that should be considered that would frankly be costless to the United States in terms of a constrained fiscal environment. The first would be, we've talked about passing Colombia and Panama. The second would be, Michael ended on the global issue, and I fully support that. Fact of the matter is we need to be encouraging Latin American countries to have a stronger voice in global fora like not just the G20, but the G8. I mean, who decided that 8 was the right number of countries to run the global economy? And why isn't there a Hispanic voice in there? For example, Brazil and Mexico, and Spain, for that matter. We should include Spain in the G8. Make it a G12 or a G whatever it is. That would be something that would be costless to the United States. We should actively think about the reinvigoration of the Office of the White House Special Envoy for the Americas, where I worked in the 1990s. It would have to be the right person, granted, with gravitas and the ability to pick up the phone and get the president on the other end. But this is a symbolic but also a substantive role that could be very important. And I think the other thing that I would add, again, to change the dynamic, to really add new emphasis, to show that this is a new day, would be to continue forward in terms of lifting some of the most punitive restrictions on Cuba. That's not to say the embargo, and it's not to say bringing Cuba into some of the hemispheric institutions that require democracy as a sine qua non of participation. So I agree with, frankly, both Lino and Michael in terms of those comments, and I think there's a balance to be struck there. But those would be 4 things that could be done very quickly without any financial cost, perhaps some political cost, but that, in my view, would really lay the groundwork for a reinvigorated policy.
Ines?
Yes, I would like to mention an issue that has not been very much present in the hemispheric agenda, but is very much tied to something that Ambassador de Seiso said at the beginning and then was picked up by Ambassador Gutierrez. Ambassador de Seiso made the point that in the past years, even though Latin America and the Caribbean had grown at the best rate in 40 years, the region was still growing less than other countries. And that's absolutely true. And Ambassador Gutierrez then mentioned the issue as well of science and technology, computers, etc. One issue that has not been very much present in the hemispheric agenda is research and development and innovation, which is absolutely crucial for economic growth and a component of a growth agenda in the hemisphere. If you look at the successful cases of countries in the past 25 years have converged to the levels of development of more developed countries, and all those countries are very diverse. It could be Korea, Australia, Sweden, etc. They have all placed emphasis not only in exporting more and penetrating export markets, but on science, technology, and innovation. So my point is, why don't we bring that issue into the hemispheric agenda? What type of things can we do jointly? For example, last year President Bachelet had a very successful trip to California, and very interesting initiatives came in terms of doing joint research between institutes in California and institutes in Chile, exchanges in academic centers. I mean, science and technology is one area where we could easily find win-win propositions. I would suggest bringing that into the forefront of the hemispheric agenda.
Thanks. Very quickly, 3 ideas. I think if we're talking about re-energizing the U.S. relationship, especially during the perceived lull during the Bush administration, you're talking about appearance, perception. In this regard, Cuba would definitely be important, but we'll have to go beyond, I think, just lifting the travel ban. You're going to have to look to really deal with the embargo and to join the rest of the hemisphere in having Cuba take part in forums. There's some disagreement, obviously, about engagement in Cuba, but I think if the hemisphere is on one side and the United States is on the other, that's going to be problematic, and it's going to remain problematic, again, from perception. I think in terms of arms, signing CIFTA, the illegal arms treaty, would be hugely important, given the impact of crime and violence on citizens throughout the hemisphere. A concrete action by the United States to show that it's concerned, not at the elite level, but at the level that impacts populations. And finally, I think vis-a-vis the current economic crisis, there is some degree of anger within the hemisphere about what's happened recently. Countries have gone through past crises, Argentina, Mexico, Brazil, and they've gotten their macroeconomic houses in order. They followed the prescriptions, only to turn around and have the United States pull the rug out from under them. So I think some acknowledgement of that would also go a long way towards changing perceptions of the United States, showing that this is really a new day and that the United States is serious about a new relationship with the hemisphere.
Anyone else?
Yeah, I think I'll repeat what I said earlier, which is the most important thing we can do is to reach out to Brazil as a partner that we will work jointly with to improve, both the economics and the political environment in the hemisphere.
Mm-hmm. Okay. There's another question which is sort of similar or related to that, which is, given Iraq, Afghanistan, North Korea, etc., how do we get the attention to Latin America that one's going to need if the U.S. is going to take any significant action? How do we raise Latin America's profile, or how does Latin America raise its own profile to compete with those other attractions? Michael?
I think Mexico is cooperating in that regard.
Exactly.
I think President Bush was exactly right when he said 6 days before 9/11 that Mexico was our most important relationship. I think we're discovering that there's no other country, geography matters, and our cultures are so intermingled, and trade on every issue. And this is a country, whatever term one wants to apply, there's no question that it's going through a very, very difficult period. And it's striking how quickly it's forced the attention of the highest officials. So I think Latin America's back on the agenda, and the associated problems that are raised by Mexico, the drug issue, the crime issue, and so forth.
Right. But I was very pleased to see several people raise the importance of Brazil and the importance of strengthening that relationship. What does Brazil have to do to become part of the primary focus?
From the crime focus?
No. How does it get the U.S. attention?
I think Brazil is more of really the opportunity, and I think a lot of the issues on energy, for example, the environment. I mean, those are natural issues where I think and this is one issue where I think President Obama, if there's any issue where he's sort of set apart from the Bush administration, it's on the environmental question. And I think with Brazil, there would be a natural kind of partnership. So I would see that it's harder because it's not as urgent and it's not the crisis, but it is, I think, the opportunity for the U.S.
Okay. CAFTA and the DR countries have moved from surplus trade balances with the U.S. into a deficit position. Is there any hope for them in the medium term?
That's the economist.
Yes, that's the answer.
Well, I mean, just from a pure technical economic perspective, that's what you would want, for them to be in the deficit position, because that means they're in a capital surplus position.
Right.
So that's a natural thing. The question is, because they're not major auto markets, I don't follow them as closely. I don't know where the investment is going. So perhaps Inez or somebody can address that.
Well, what is true is that in the past years, I mean, we mentioned, all of us mentioned that Latin America and the Caribbean had a very successful export performance, but that was more true of the South American countries because the terms of trade were much more favorable to South America than Central America. And as a matter of fact, terms of trade to Central America were negative in the past years. And now they are improving a little bit because of the decline in the price of oil. So, and they have had tough competition in the U.S. market, tough competition with Chinese exports. So that puts, again, the emphasis on how to add more value added to exports, how to upgrade exports, and goes back to the issue of innovation. I think that is crucial for Mexico and the Central American economies, especially given the export structure and competing with many products with Asia in the U.S. market.
I agree with that. And the other thing that I would add would be that Central America, comparatively, the economies are fairly micro compared even to other Latin American countries like Brazil, Colombia, Peru. I mean, if you put the size of El Salvador's GNP next to Brazil, it's quite small. And so to the extent that Central America can begin to see itself and frankly position itself as a unified both production platform and also market, and less of 5 or 7, depending on how you define it, individual economies, I think that will be good for the region, because if you look at how investors look at Central America, they actually see the region as a unified whole. They don't see it in Nicaragua, Honduras, whatever, because those economies just aren't large enough in terms of a broader investment strategy. But if you have separate economies, you also have separate regulations and separate tax policies and separate repatriation rules and separate labor codes and all these things that businesses have to deal with. And so to the extent that you can, and CAFTA stripped away much of that, but to the extent you can continue that process, I think that would very much benefit the region, because that would then continue to draw some of the investment that we've seen evaporate, not because people aren't interested in Central America, but just because global capital flows have deteriorated dramatically, and when they deteriorate, the first countries that they go away from, of course, are going to be the smallest markets and the places where people don't perceive, the most dramatic opportunity. So I think, Jim, that's probably something that I would add to the conversation on that.
I would add, in the Central American case, it's an excellent opportunity for a sort of a test case of energy integration, where the electrical grid, where alternative sources of energy can be used, where there are different possibilities for linking the countries together. All of them are hydrocarbons poor. They all need new sources of energy. This is an area where the U.S., Brazil, and others can cooperate to try to energize these economies through greater energy development and integration.
Okay, we have several questions directed at individual panelists. Mahatara, you said that none of the Latin American countries are in crisis. What about Argentina, Venezuela, Ecuador, and Nicaragua?
If you look, that's an interesting question you bring up, because if you look at, let's say, GDP growth, I know Argentina and Venezuela are still showing positive GDP growth. Ecuador slipped in the last quarter. Nicaragua, I'll be quite honest with you, I don't follow very closely. But the point is that if you go back in history, every time we have had a global economic crisis, the GDP growth in these countries has fallen much more than the average. This time it's falling much less than the average, even in those countries. And as I pointed out, those are not what I would call my models for the region. You know, those were the exceptions that, you know, from my perspective, did not follow very good economic policies, broadly speaking, and yet, you know, they're doing reasonably well. And, you know, one of the interesting things is when you look at capital flows, the countries may think of themselves as countries, but capital markets think of it as a region. And you tend to have flight from the region whenever you have capital withdrawal. So to the extent that the large economies in the region, in particular Mexico and Brazil, at this point are very well managed, you have not had that capital flight from that region. So, you know, that's really helping all countries in the region at this point.
Okay. Mr. Farnsworth, we have one for you. Investment and growth have benefited mostly the elites in Latin America. How can poverty and inequality be addressed?
Well, it's the critical question, and it's a very appropriate question. I think there are a couple things that one has to understand about Latin America generally, but the short answer is, in order to diffuse the benefits of trade and investment throughout the economy, you have to prepare your entire citizenry, or at least the vast majority of them, to be able to take advantage of a global economy. And how do you do that? You do it through education. Council of Americas and other organizations have done a lot of work in terms of comparative analysis between Latin America and Asia. And what you find is, for example, that the Asians have over 12 years on average of formal education for their populations, over 12 years. In Latin America, the equivalent is less than 6 years of formal education. And so it's very, very difficult to conceive of an economy to be able to be competitive in a global environment if the average level of your workforce is six years of formal education. So I think that's step number one. Obviously, that's a longer-term perspective. The fact of the matter is the Spanish have a parable that says the best time to plant a tree is either 20 years ago or today. So the fact of the matter is, just because it didn't happen 20 years ago or a generation ago or 500 years ago does not mean it should not start now with massive investments in education throughout the region. I think that's point number one. I think point number two is probably a direction that the person who asked the question probably won't expect me to go with this, but the second part of the answer is that Latin America has got to do much better in terms of ensuring that its business environment is actually more democratic than it has been in the past. What that means is that competition in the economy is actually something that is widely practiced through regulations and through anti-monopolistic practices, so that companies cannot aggregate to themselves much of the benefit of open economies. And in fact, the companies and the economy itself becomes much more competitive, so that the entrepreneurial nature of much of Latin American citizens can actually come through to the fore in developing a much more a much healthier economy across the region. And those countries that have paid attention to competition policy, in the United States we would call it, anti-monopoly practices, in the Department of Justice and FCC and all the agencies would have direct responsibility for that. Those Latin American countries that have paid a lot of attention to that have actually not coincidentally done the best. And then the final thing that I would say, there are many things many directions one could go, but Inez raised the issue of R&D, and I think that's absolutely critical too. The whole point of building an economy is one that has to be based on something beyond the commodities trade. Commodities trade is highly capital intensive. You can put in billions of dollars into mining, but that doesn't create a whole lot of jobs. And so until you can actually get an economy that's based on value-added production, which goes to the heart of what Inez was saying about R&D, as well as what I just said about education, you're going to have economies that are based on big companies with a lot of capital investment that don't create jobs. And that's exactly what you've seen across Latin America. So yeah, they're open economies, and the macro economy does pretty well, The microeconomy is something where I think the questioner is going, and I think those are some very important points that I would make on that in that regard.
Okay, thank you. Here's one for the panel. In Mexico, Calderon is employing the military in support of the police. The armed forces in Colombia have been heavily engaged internally for several decades. In Venezuela, the military is being politicized, and even in Bolivia, we have a military officer as a stand-in prefect. Would like to have your comments on the future role of the armed forces in the Americas in security and governance.
I'll start with that. There are a couple of issues that are involved there. One is civilian control over the military in a traditional sense. And I think the region has done extraordinarily well and progressed well in that regard. That generally in the region, not only is civilian control over the military well established, but civil-military relations have improved a lot since the days of the 1970s. Regarding the role of the military in terms of national security. The conditions in the different countries are different, and therefore the roles will be different. Colombia clearly was a case where the state presence was very scant in a lot of areas, where legitimate state authority was severely challenged by illegally armed groups, and the military had to play an important role and has played a very important role in reestablishing legitimate state control and authority in Colombia. I think the Colombians are also well aware of the need for a much stronger police force, and they've made substantial progress in that area and in areas where there is a transition taking place from control by non-state actors to legitimate state actors. There's a past process in which the military, once it's established control, quickly tries to turn power over to turn local security control over to the police, a handoff between the two. In the case of Mexico, the substantial participation of the military in what is basically a traditional law enforcement role is a matter of necessity. The Mexican police are simply overwhelmed by the challenge and unable to deal with it, and the military is involved because of the challenge of the situation. But that is, again, points to the need for substantial improvements in the quality of civilian policing, in their recruitment, in their pay, in their training, and all of that points to I think an overall weakness in the region of Latin America in terms of the quality of policing and the relationship between the police and local communities.
And Jim, I would just first of all, I agree with everything the ambassador said, and maybe I would just extend the comment one degree further, and that is that we've seen, I think, tremendous advances in civilian control of various militaries throughout the hemisphere, and I also agree that in Mexico, for example, and elsewhere as well, that the use of the military in a law enforcement role is perforce. I mean, it's not an election. It's to stop the bleeding. I mean, something has to be done immediately. The question is, though, and where I'd like to extend the conversation a little bit further, the question is, will the various governments, to include Mexico and the militaries, understand that to be an aberration and not in the best interest of the overall society in the long term? And this goes beyond, in my mind, the notion of civilian control of the military. Civilian control of the military is absolutely critical, it's essential, but it goes to the notion of the role of the armed forces in society, and that each and every member of the armed forces understands the role of the armed forces in society, and the larger societies understand the role of the armed forces in society as well. And so I think that's kind of the next evolutionary step, I think, in this somewhat troublesome thing that we're observing in the use of military and law enforcement.
That was precisely the point I was going to make, based on not experience in Latin America, but in Pakistan, that the military is brought in or comes in because it's perceived as not corrupt. And yet, the longer it stays, the more corruption infiltrates the military. And that's always a delicate balancing act. You know, at which point do you bring in the military, but then you get the military to leave also. And that's the hard part in most countries.
Yes, I mean, just look at Brazil. I mean, we've raised Brazil several times. The Brazilian revolution, or coup, whatever you want to call it, in '64 came in large part because the military was seen as honest, non-corruptible, good administrators, and they would take care of the country. And the first several years they were. However, as time went on, they became just as corrupt as the civilian government. And frankly, it was their own fear of what was happening to their institution that was largely responsible for their leaving power and giving it back to the civilians. Carlo.
Let me make a point to underline just how difficult it will be, this agenda, to improve police forces in the hemisphere. Military involvement exists not only in cases of Mexico, Colombia, and elsewhere, Central America, but also in the Caribbean. This is a case where you have defense forces constantly going in the case of Jamaica, to bail out the police when they get pinned down in the schemes in Kingston, and they're also involved in other areas. Part of the military involvement is structural. Part of the drug problem is trade. Drugs coming in, frontier forces, there'll always be a role for the military. But direct policing is something that we see, even in the case of the Caribbean, where you have fairly well-developed, fairly well-financed, and fairly well-trained, again, a regional comparison, fairly well-trained police forces, and yet you still see the military involved. So this really, to my mind, just highlights how difficult, how expensive, and how time-consuming will be the agenda in terms of building up police forces. Obviously, the military is involved because the police aren't capable of doing the job. The police aren't capable of doing the job for some historic reasons, but also because we haven't put in the resources and efforts to make them capable of doing the job.
Anyone else? Okay, we have a question for Mr. Shifter. If the term war on drugs is not useful, what would you propose as an alternative?
Well, you know, I think it's always tempting to sort of try to find catchphrases, but the reason why I don't think the war on drugs and you know, Latin Americans, including Calderon and others, allies of the United States, also share this view, is that, you know, the drug, it's not like sort of one day we're going to sort of be able to claim victory. This is I think, an issue that is, just looking at it in a very realistic way, is going to be with us for a long time. And I think there is sort of a framework that is being advanced of trying to sort of reduce the harm that's being done, not only here in terms of the consumption and demand side and treatment, but also on the supply side, just to kind of manage it better. And I think that is the, you know, I think that is kind of a more balanced approach that I think doesn't imply that somehow we're going to sort of, that one day there's going to be, we'll be able to declare victory. So I think it's just the way you deal with it.
Okay. Anyone else? Yes, go ahead.
I think, you know, there seemed to be consensus that legalization was a bad idea. I think we ought to really think about that. Whether it's legalization or de facto legalization, if you go through many of the Asian cities, they have areas of the city where drug consumption and trafficking is tolerated, you know, generally, you know, battle zones, whatever you want to call them. But what it does is it keeps it out of the rest of the community. And that is a model that, you know, Amsterdam is trying, some of the European cities now are trying again. You know, whether they call it legal or not, it's de facto legal that you can engage in certain behaviors in a very narrow area. But that pulls it out of the rest of the community and the damage that does. So I think there's several options that need to be thought through, because, you know, a war on drug implies you're declaring war on the traders, but not necessarily on the consumers. And unless you address both sides of it, you're not going to solve this problem. And that's why it's so important to think of both sides of the equation and try to see if you can have some sort of a balance. But the most important thing is pull it out of the community, general community.
Carlo?
I would just, a strong note here. I disagree that there's consensus that legalization is a bad idea or decriminalization is a bad idea. There certainly isn't consensus on that in the hemisphere, and I don't think there's consensus on this panel either.
I mean, let me just add a couple thoughts. We hear a lot that all the focus is on the supply, and there's been no focus on reducing demand in the United States. I don't see how that's a truthful statement. I mean, I don't see how there's no effort to attack drugs in the United States. I don't see how. I mean, I have kids in school. Law enforcement's very active in the schools. I don't understand how the United States can be accused of not trying to eradicate drugs in the United States. Now, have we been effective? No, by definition we haven't. But I think the pendulum has swung too far. Consuming countries are consuming countries. The United States, Brazil is increasingly a consuming country. Canada is a consuming country. Spain is the gateway of drugs to Europe. Sure, it's a United States problem, but it's really a problem of wealth. And the problem is not going to go away based on, if we all of a sudden claim responsibility for it or not. What I find to be unsatisfying about where the drug debate is right now is, other than the idea of legalization or decriminalization, which is a differentiation without a difference, I think, what's the alternative? What's the alternative? I mean, honestly. I was on congressional testimony a couple months ago, and a fellow person giving testimony said we need to legalize cocaine. Well, no, we don't need to legalize cocaine. And the fact of the matter is the whole Cartagena summit and the San Antonio summit came about because the United States was enduring a crack epidemic in the late 80s and early 90s. And George Bush called the countries together or met in Cartagena not because we wanted to condemn the source countries, but because as a domestic issue, this was overwhelming Washington. And so we had to get a handle on it. And so coming directly out of Cartagena and San Antonio was not this idea that, who's responsible for drugs or not. It was an idea of together we can try to work to defeat it. And directly what came out of that was the ATPA, Indian Trade Preference Act, which applied to 4 source countries, Bolivia, Peru, Ecuador, and Colombia, which was expanded in 2000 to become the ATPDEA, the Indian Trade Preference Drug Eradication Act. And it was expanded to include extra categories and all this. I don't see how the United States is by saying, yes, we have a drug problem. Okay, that's a statement of fact and it's a statement of reality. But how does that change the dynamic? And how does that get us to the point of working more collaboratively with the countries in the hemisphere to address what is really a very serious problem for all of us? And until we can start hearing some solutions of people saying, well, specifically, what does that mean? Then I think this I'm not talking about the panel today, I'm talking about the broader anti-drug or drug discussion just remains very unsatisfying, I think. I'd like to hear some actual solutions. Before you start talking about, it's all the United States' fault or decriminalization, let's have some alternatives.
Okay. One for Ambassador Gutierrez. Would you agree to stopping the embargo against Cuba if that country agrees to a democratic process?
Yes.
That's an easy one.
Mr. Joe Biden.
Okay, maybe the last question.
Just
for
a quick point. No, the embargo. Look, the embargo is a symbol more than anything else. The United States is Cuba's 4th largest trading partner right now.
Right now.
Right now.
Really?
Yes. Drugs. Medicine sales. Pharmaceuticals. Thank you. Have been legal since 1992, and food sales have been legal since 2000. And Cuba has bought a lot of agricultural goods from the U.S. So travel is the one remaining element of the embargo. And yes, I think if Cuba agreed to a democratic process that could be verified, sure, Why not lift the embargo? But not unilaterally, not in exchange for nothing.
Okay. And the last question for Peter DeShazo. Peter, President Obama and Secretary Clinton have referred to new energy partnerships. How can this be made attractive to Latin Americans and not have it become just an initiative to feed U.S. consumption?
Okay, to feed U.S. consumption. Well, I think our interest in energy consumption is important, and our interest in maintaining different supplies of energy from our neighbors is extremely important. So the idea that somehow that's the two factors are in conflict. There's a development side to energy, a sense that energy is a missing component in a lot of countries. I talked before about Central America and how a greater energy cooperation from outside, either through multilateral organizations or the international financial institutions, can help countries in Central America that are energy poor but have a potential for developing renewable sources of energy or non-traditional sources of energy, or better use of their electric grid and greater integration of their energy sources. This is something that the U.S. can do. The U.S. has its own energy interests, but those will coincide with other countries as well. Our relationship with Canada and Mexico is strongly based on trade. It's also strongly based on energy. They're being our first and third largest sources of imported oil, and Canada our number one source of natural gas. So we have our national interests, but we also have the interests of a strengthened economy in the region, and there are plenty of ways in which we can accommodate both.
Actually, the Mexican exports, I gather, are tending down, and the production is also down. So,
which is a concern for the United States as well as for Mexico.
Well, yes. The point is that they're saying that in a few years, Mexico may not have excess petroleum to export, which would create a problem for us, and of course a serious financial problem for Mexico. How do you see that evolving? Is there any way we could convince the Mexicans to undertake the investment necessary to increase production?
The economic circumstances in Mexico eventually are going to have to. There already been steps taken to reform Pemex, but basically there's a lot more investment that's needed to explore and to, more importantly, to produce oil in deep water. And without the new fields coming online, Mexico's production is going to continue to fall, and something like 40% of government revenue comes from Pemex in Mexico. So it's absolutely essential for Mexico to be able to inject a new dynamic into its energy situation.
Well, that strikes me as an area where there could be excellent cooperation with benefits for both parties. Mexico needs the capital, needs the technology, and we certainly need the petroleum. And so I would think that a happy compromise could be met there. Well, thank you very much. I think that we'll close it for today. I just want to say that we will be doing a summary of this and put it on our website by the end of the week. So if anybody would like to go back and check any of the points, that'll be there. But maybe if I could just try to summarize a little bit what was said today. I think we all agreed that the financial crisis occurred when Latin America was going through one of the best development periods in its history. It's had an effect on Latin America, but it hasn't been as large as it's been in the U.S. Some of domestic policies in Latin America have led to difficult situations, but those are aside from the financial crisis. The best thing the U.S. can do for Latin America is to resolve its own economic problem, maintain the trade flows, and in fact increase the free trade area agreements and make access to the U.S. market and the U.S. financial market accessible to Latin America. and that means going ahead, maybe expanding NAFTA or making it richer, implementing the Colombian and the Panamanian agreements, and pushing forward with the Doha round, see if we can't finally achieve something on the Doha round. But it's also been emphasized that Latin American development depends on education, on technology, and therefore, and those require domestic policies in Latin America. There's not much we can do there, although there is some persuasion, perhaps. And there should be much more cooperation between the U.S. and Latin America. The point of the summit becomes very clear. We should take the summit forum and revive it and give it more applicability and have a good deal more cooperation and discussion of the major issues in the hemisphere, whether it's drugs, whether it's trade, whether it's development, whether it's technology transfer. But the summit could create the forum within which these issues could be discussed honestly and an answer sought, because an answer will not appear from one day to the next. There are disagreements, there are different views, and they have to be talked out, they have to be talked through, and some sort of a consensus achieved. And I would like to note, since we do so much work with Brazil, I'm very pleased today that so many people here on the panel recognize the importance of Brazil and our need to develop a deeper, broader relationship with Brazil. We are natural allies. We have many interests in common. It's a matter of recognizing that and pushing that cooperation forward. And that, in turn, can be used to generate more cooperation throughout the hemisphere. I want to thank you very much. I really enjoyed this panel, these discussions, the comments. I, of course, haven't agreed with everything, but they were interesting points. And I want to thank you very much for being with us today. Let's give them a hand of applause, okay?
Nice to meet you. Did you say you are going to go to the conference?
Good to see you.